Chapter 24 of Painted Fires by Nellie McClung. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Atul Sharma, Winnipeg, Canada. Chapter 24. It was at Fort Simpson in November, on his way out, that Jack Doran heard of the war. They had floated down the Nahanni River on a moose skin barge to the Liard, and down the Liard to the Mackenzie on a spruce scow. Arriving in Fort Simpson one raw November day when an icy wind from the north gave warning of the freeze-up, they had brought with them a few furs, which George, the half-breed guide, had got with his trap lines, and from the sale of these they hoped to be able to buy supplies for the home journey. Their summer had been full of adventure. They had seen the leaves come on the trees, the flowers bud, bloom and fade, the leaves fall, and now the lowering clouds of November, driven by the cold winds. But with their bags full of gold quartz to show what they had found, and their little heap of dust carried in chamois bags and glass phials, they were elated and confident. Jack, with all the eagerness of an amateur, had been full of enthusiasm going in, and in the washing of gold from the sand of the river, he had enjoyed endless delight. To see the glint of yellow gold in the black sands at the bottom of a pan fired his imagination. Keith had complimented him on his success in panning. "She's getting better all the time," Keith had said. "So we are getting closer to the deposits." He had a map of the country showing the exact spot where the claims would be staked. "You'll have some nuggets to bring home to that new wife of yours that will make her eyes pop out of her head." It was in September they reached the place, and Keith announced the object of their search achieved. They staked their claims and gathered some rich pieces of quartz to bring back with them. Keith was exultant, and even George, the half-breed, grew garrulous with the prospect of riches. He was going to have 3 cars and a colored driver in a gray uniform. Keith had the plan for mining all arranged. He showed them where the sluices would be placed, drawing a diagram to show the angle at which they would be set, and how the riffles would be put in the bottom. He would bring the water in a pipeline from further up the river and throw it against the banks of gravel in powerful jets. At the falls up the river, he would generate the electricity to run a stamp mill, where the crushed rock would be reduced to powder and passed through a sieve, and the gold collected on copper plates. "You'll see a bigger trek to this field than there was in '98, he assured his eager listeners. The return journey, lacking the stimulus of novelty which had kept them from discouragement going in, was toilsome and depressing. Their way lay through a gloomy, barren country, and the weather was cold and wet. The shortening days and lengthening nights, too, were unfavorable to traveling. But at length, ragged, unkempt, unshaven and dirty, they arrived in Fort Simpson just before the freeze-up. The good-natured proprietor of the store bought their furs and outfitted them, giving them the news of the war as the transaction went on. "I wish I was younger and I'd be off," he said. "I'd like to do a bit of fighting before my time comes to step off." "What is it all about?" Jack asked as he tried on a pair of long boots. "Well, I'm not clear on that, but sure it's a poor war that ain't better than no war. And you see, war has to come once in a while to clear out the surplus population. We breed too fast, ain't that the truth? So it's either pestilence, war, or famine, and war's a lot more fun than the other two." Jack looked at him indignantly. "How many children have you?" he asked. He had noticed several little half-breeds around the store, moccasin-footed, noiseless, beady-eyed, looking inquiringly at the strangers. The storekeeper did not resent the question at all. "I think there are 6 boys big enough to go," he said. 3 of them are out on the trap lines and haven't heard about it yet. But the other 3 are going out. Their mother is cutting up a little, but she'll calm down. She's a good woman. We have 8 others coming on. It's a good chance for the boys to see the world." The war did not relate itself in any way to Jack Doran until he arrived at Peace River. He had one consuming thought in his mind now, and only one, and that was to get to Eagle Mines as soon as he could, and to Helmi. He went at once to the telegraph office and sent her a wire. "Mrs. Jack Doran, Eagle Mines. Back safe. Expect me in a week. Love, Jack." Peace River was alive with excitement. Homesteaders walked the streets, waiting for the train to take them to Edmonton. There was some delay, owing to trouble on the Judah Hill. Jack, Keith, and George got a room at the Peace, and soon had the grime of travel washed away, and went to the dining room for supper. Men in uniform sat at a table, eating noisily and drinking. The room was full of excited talk. There was a meeting in the hall that night, advertised by a huge red poster in the stores. It said that Major Dowsett and Private George Crow would address the meeting. Private Crow had been wounded at Mons and had been invalided to Canada. There were flags in the dining room, and on the way in that day they had noticed flags flying from the houses and stores, fluttering bravely in the cold wind. To the hall they went at 8 o'clock, and were met at the door by women selling red roses for the Red Cross. A band inside was playing "It's a Long, Long Way to Tipperary." To Jack it seemed as though he had come back to a new world, a nervous, panicky, high-strung world, abounding in new phrases, new emotions. Fresh from the solitudes of the North, he could not at once grasp the meaning of it all. Private Crow, a pale lad, standing on a crutch, spoke first, and spoke simply and well. His superior officer had chided him for the mildness of his address at Spirit River the night before. "You've got to put more thunder into it," he said. "These people want color and action. Tell them about the children you saw with their hands cut off." "But I didn't see any," protested the lad. "Well, you heard of them. You might have seen them. Speed up a little. Lay it on thicker, or you'll never get recruits." But again, the boy told just what he had seen: the mud, the hardships, the indescribable carnage, the comradeship and heroism of his companions of the trenches. There was no hatred, revenge, or bitterness in his heart, only a great bewilderment. He appealed on behalf of his comrades. They were so brave, so cheerful, and so fine, so willing to die. Jack's heart was torn with the pity of it. Worst of all were the boy's twitching hands, never still a moment. What horrors that boy must have come through. His lips had quivered as he spoke, like a child's about to cry. "Don't leave those boys alone. Send them reinforcements. The more we can send, the sooner it will be over." That was the message of the quivering lips, coming from a heart that was clean and brave. He could talk without apology, could Private Crow. He could ask any person to make a sacrifice and not ask them to do more than he had done. Major Dowsett, who arranged the program, had left himself for the last. In the ordinary affairs of life, Major Dowsett believed in being first, but, understanding what he would have called mob psychology, he believed the last speaker had the best chance. He began by damning the Germans with great spirit, reviewing their history, military aspirations, and their home life. He showed that they threatened the whole world. Major Dowsett had not been further than Boulogne during the present war, but one would never know it from his speech. It reeked with the stench of battle. It abounded in personal incidents. He dragged his listeners into shell holes, dugouts, and across no man's land. He specialized on the treachery of the Germans, the hatefulness of their women, the bitter hatred they had instilled into their children. He had lived with them, he said, and he knew it. It seemed that he and Lord Roberts knew the war was coming, but England had not listened to them. Then he exalted war and military life. It developed the best in a man, and at this the Major beat his breast, directing his audience to that storehouse of accumulated virtues. Then he appealed to the young men to get into the game. He painted the glory of it, the freedom of it. The army was the place where a man was a man. The nation's hero was the warrior. Mollycoddles have no place in the world, especially with women. There was truth in the old song yet. If a lad a lass would marry, he must learn a gun to carry. Then, in a lighter vein, the gallant Major hinted at the charm of the French girls and how they admired the Canadians. His manner indicated that but for the presence of the ladies, he could tell more. While he was speaking, Private Crow's hands were never still, nor did his lips cease from trembling. The Major then called for recruits. "1 volunteer," he said, "is better than 10 conscripts. Conscription is coming, though." He gloated over this. "We cannot desert our army now. If men will not fight of their own accord, there are other methods. The major unconsciously tapped his sword. Suddenly it became apparent, even to the major, that the spirit had gone out of the meeting. His audience sat stony-faced and rigid. The fires had gone out. The current was off. There was no response to his call. The appeal had not gone home to the men of the North, who loved the long trail with its campfires and its peace. Brave men who do their duty from an inward sense, but to whom the thought of force brings not fear but rebellion. The chairman tried to save the situation by calling for a song, but something had gone from the meeting. The people began to straggle out. As Jack made his way back to the hotel, he was deeply disturbed in mind. There was no moon, but the night was bright with stars. Looking up, he saw the North Star like an old friend, looking so remote, serene, and undismayed, though nations were rocking with war and hatred. The major and his fiery eloquence were easy to turn aside, but Private Crow, so pale and shaken, quivering with the horror of war, walked beside him in spirit. The hotel that night resounded with jangling noise, shrill voices, snatches of song, bursts of harsh laughter. The major was a prince of storytellers. "Say, boys, did you hear this one? One of the boys who had been on leave." Roars of laughter followed, then more beer. "Too much hard liquor is bad," laughed the major, "but too much beer is just right. No danger of being pinched for being noisy. We have both the proprietor and the policeman. Now listen to this. There was a French girl." At 1 o'clock the party broke up. The major had secured 6 names. He decided the next morning to let Private Crow go back to the city. The kid was all right, but he lacked pep. This was the job for a real he-man. And after all, the best little recruiter apart from himself, if it ever could be considered apart from himself, was the amber-colored bottle. It gave just the proper warmth and glow. Jack made his journey around by Edmonton to Eagle Mines, arriving there on the first day of February. There had been no reply to his wire. He stepped off the train with a strangely beating heart. Helmi would be there surely, but the platform was almost bare. Not a person whom he knew did he see as he hurried across the street and over to his own house. The door was not locked, and he went in. A strange scene met his eyes. Dirty dishes on the table, the remains of a slovenly meal, ashes from cigars on the plates, the bed showing that it had been slept in. The coffee pot was on the stove. The floor had been tramped by muddy feet and spat upon by tobacco chewers, and a forgotten pipe was on the window-sill. The air was heavy with tobacco smoke and the stale fumes of beer. Jack's heart was heavy with apprehension. He went up to the loft by the ladder on the wall. The bed there had been used too, and a man's coat was thrown across it. There it was, the house he had built, defaced, defiled. What did it mean? He would know what it meant. He would go over to the boarding house. Mrs. McMahon, a few minutes later, related the interview to her friend Mrs. Turner. "He bounded in at me," she said, "just when I was putting the potatoes on to boil. 'Where's Helmi?' he almost shouted at me, without even bidding me the time of day. How could I tell him where Helmi was? 'She's not here,' I said, 'and I don't know where she is. She's been gone over a month,' I says. 'Where did she go?' he said. 'To Edmonton,' I said. 'Why did she go?' he stormed. 'Didn't she know I was coming back? Where did she say she was going?' 'Well, Helmi never confided in me, as you know,' I said. Land, I couldn't tell him why she went. I never was one that could talk about those things. I don't believe any of my people could. The weeks were funny that way. 'Where's Sim?' he said at last, staring at me as if he didn't see me. 'Sim had an accident in the mine and went out the last train.' 'Well, look here, Mrs. McMahon. Who has been staying in my house?' he says. 'Can you tell me that?' I knew very well a party of hunters had spent the night there, swells from town out deer shooting, drunk as fools too. I wouldn't let them in. 'I certainly have no knowledge of what's been going on in your house since you've gone,' I said, very stiff. Mr. McMahon always said there was no one could be stiffer than I could when I wanted to be. 'Do you know of anyone having stayed there?' he said. 'Yes,' I says. 'The crazy Englishman from English Creek was there for a week, about 6 weeks ago.' Lord, I thought he was going to strike me, But none of the Weeks was ever cowards, so I just glared back at him, stiff as pork. I could give him eye for eye, let me tell you. He went out at that and over to the office. I think maybe he expected a letter from Helmi, but if she's written to him, it's more than she's done for any of us. Gone over a month and not a word from her. And I was good to that girl, though I ain't the one to tell what I've done for anyone. Now, if Jack Doran had come in a better spirit, he might have heard more from me. I'm funny that way. Anyone can lead me, but strong horses can't drive me. Jack Doran went to the post office. He was moving automatically now. His voice sounded queer to him, and his tongue felt like a piece of rope. "Are there any letters for me, Mr. Armstrong?" he asked, hoping his voice was not beating like his heart. "Two have just come for Mrs. Doran," said the postmaster, handing them to him. "Glad to see you back to us again, Jack. People come and go at Eagle Mines. Come and go. It makes it hard for a postmaster." Jack went back to his own house. He must get under cover. The eyes of the people he met hurt him. They bored into him, twisting, turning, screwing, gouging, red hot and sharp as ice. He must get somewhere where he could shut the door. In his own house, Jack sat with the letters in his hand. Helmi had gone. She had not waited. He was a month late, but Helmi should have waited. Where had she gone? The letters might tell him. It would be better to know. He opened the first one and found it contained a government check for $15, payable to Helmi Doran, and it said it was on account of Private Arthur Warner. Jack stared at it without understanding. The other letter was from Montreal. "Dear Helmi," it said, "I have made over my separation allowance to you, and I hope you will accept it from me. You are the only person in Canada who has any claim on me. I have paid every other person in Canada for everything they have ever done for me. You, dear Helmi, I can never pay in money, for you gave me the most precious thing a man can have who goes out as I am going, a memory of something tender and sweet. I have made my will, leaving everything I have to you. I will never forget your last words to me. Nobody ever spoke to me like that before. Will you write to me, Helmi? Ever yours, Arthur Warner." With the letter in his hand, Jack sat looking at his polluted house, his poor, desolate, violated house, the emblem of his own life. He had built this house with his own hands, lovingly, taking pleasure in driving every nail and fitting every board. And now, so it had been with his life. He had lived it cleanly, decently. Try as he would, Jack could not believe that Helmi had forgotten him or been unfaithful to her marriage vow. If the worst he feared was true, it was some racial fault in her. Helmi had not sinned as an individual. What did he know of her traditions? He felt he knew her but little, although she was his wife. Nothing could alter that. She was his wife. A dog came whimpering to the door. As Jack opened it, the sable collie, thin and miserable, sorely neglected since old Sim had gone, looked timidly in at him. Jack recognized the animal, the crazy Englishman's dog. Mrs. McMahon said the Englishman had stayed at his house 6 weeks before. Here was the proof, and this explained the letters. Arthur Warner. Jack had never heard his name. He had seen him, though, a strange, uncouth, unshaven fellow. Restraining a first impulse to drive the dog away, Jack coaxed her to come in, which she did, shiveringly. Her feet were sore, her nose hot. Jack went to the butcher shop and bought her some meat, which the hungry animal accepted gratefully. The dog was not to blame, whoever else might be. The butcher told him about the dog. The crazy Englishman had shot all his dogs but her. Cleo is her name, and it seems he could not bring himself to shoot her. Old Sim looked after her until he got hurt and had to go to the hospital. Yes, sure, I'll give her bones. It's real good of you to be providing for her. The Englishman wasn't any friend of yours either, was he? One resolve Jack arrived at. He must get out. He could not spend the night in his little broken house, every inch of which was so dear to him, the little house that had lost its soul. When Jack left it, he did not think of locking the door, although there were things in it, the stove, chairs, table, beds, for which he had paid his hard-earned money. But it did not matter now. His little house, which he had built so eagerly, had been violated. Jack sealed the letters and returned them to the post office, then hired a team at the livery stable and drove to Bannerman, where he would catch a train for Edmonton. On the way, he met the timekeeper, who apparently did not want to speak, for although Jack drew up his horses, the other one went on. Recognizing Jack, he feared embarrassing questions in respect to the money which had been owing. The timekeeper had one rule: if trouble seemed near, make a wide detour and get around it. Something might happen before it again comes near. Someone might die. The world might come to an end. The coming of the war had made all things possible. So, instead of stopping when he saw Jack drawing up his horses, he hurried on. Jack believed the timekeeper's reluctance to speak was because of what had happened, and his heart grew still heavier. A pale moon and starlight enabled the horses to follow the trail, leaving him free to pursue his own gloomy thoughts. He thought, with a stab of memory, of the words he and Helmi said across the running water. The stream was silent now in its fetters of ice, and the marks of their feet in the soft sandy banks had been obscured long ago. He wondered if Helmi had forgotten it, wondered too if he would ever be able to forget. At the top of the hill, when the flickering lights of the little town came into view, Jack remembered Helmi's fears when they had come there together. "It is not a friendly place," she had cried. "It will bring bad luck. See, the houses are like angry cats about to spring." And he had laughed at her for her foolish fancy. He marveled now at her premonition of evil, and try as he might, he could not overcome his love for her. He wanted her, his high-tempered Finn girl whose eyes were so tender. Helmi, with the lovely shining hair and the eager questioning mind. No, if he had lost Helmi, he had lost everything. Life could not hurt him any more. If Helmi had deceived him, he was proof against misfortune. He might as well go to the war. There was no reason for his staying behind if Helmi were gone. And if he went, he might meet Arthur Warner and pay off the score. Having an hour to wait for the train, Jack wandered around the town. He did not wish to talk to anyone. The night was fine and clear, with northern lights circling and folding in the sky with a crumpling sound like the rustle of silk. Pink and mauve, violet and amber, they advanced and retreated in endless maneuvers, shooting, darting, rolling and unrolling, shimmering and dancing. He and Helmi had watched them with endless enjoyment from the north window of their own little house last year. A sudden impulse came to him to go and see the magistrate. He might know something. Anything would be better than this torturing uncertainty. The magistrate was in and shook hands kindly, too kindly. Jack judged from his manner that he had some damaging evidence, and that he was glad he had it. "I came home today," Jack began at once, "expecting to find my wife, but they tell me she has gone to the city. I expected to be home a month earlier, but was delayed in the north. I can find no trace of her, nor any reason for her going. Do you know anything about her?" "I did not know she had gone until today," said the magistrate. "I had a letter from a friend who saw her in the city." Jack started eagerly. "Where in the city? I shall go there tonight." The magistrate rubbed the bristles on his chin with a distinctly soiled forefinger. Then, with one thumb, he pressed back the cuticle on the other until it hurt. He loved to do this. When he couldn't hurt anyone else, he hurt himself. "I wouldn't try to find her, Mr. Doran, if I were you. She is in a place where you would not be pleased to find her. I don't care where she is. She is my wife, and I will never believe that she has done wrong unless she tells me so. I know her better than you do." "I am sorry for you, Mr. Doran, and that is why I am patient with you. This Milander girl has gone back to her old associates, the Chinese. She is in one of the all-night eating houses. I suppose you know what it means when a white girl goes into one of these places." Jack sat staring at him. "Who was your friend who saw her there?" "I would rather not tell. It is not necessary that I should," and he wrote in confidence. He knew I was interested. "She evidently tired of the quiet life here. These girls crave excitement. There was some talk about her and the Englishman who owns the bungalow at English River. He stayed with her for a week before he enlisted. That is common talk at the mines. Men who are going out to fight, like to take their fling." He did not need to hurt his own thumb now. Jack Doran's face was enough. It had grown suddenly old and seamed and full of hatred. His nostrils quivered like those of a racehorse. He was about to go, but the magistrate waved him to a seat. "Mr. Doran, you were very indignant with me a year ago, or a little less, when I dared to advise you. You were quite indignant, and of course I am ready to admit your feelings at that time were very creditable, mistaken, but creditable. Since then, you have had a bitter lesson, a very bitter lesson. I did not harbor any ill will. On the contrary, I was still ready to be your friend. I was your friend, even though you scouted my friendship." Colonel Blackwood leaned over and his voice fell. "A man in my position does not expect thanks. We do not get thanks, but that is quite all right. We do not expect thanks, but I hope you see that I was trying to befriend you." "I cannot see anything very clearly," said Jack, miserably. "I only know my wife is gone. Circumstantial evidence seems to be against her, but nevertheless I will do my utmost to find her. I will take her word against the world." The magistrate laughed softly, but there was no mirth in the sound. "Have a drink, my dear young friend," he said, "and forget her." "No, thank you," said Jack. "I do not drink, and I am pretty sure I will never forget her." There was something in the young man's voice and in his face that made Colonel Blackwood wonder if he had pursued the right course. Perhaps he should tell of her coming to him, to find out about the marriage. Perhaps he should tell. No, the hellcat. She had been impertinent to him, and she had threatened him. When Jack had gone, the magistrate sat a long time, wondering. Then he went to the cupboard and poured himself a drink. Ah, that was better. Now he knew he was right. Another drink, and he was sure that he had done not only a wise but a noble thing in leaving the marriage unrecorded. After the third drink, he sat in a mellow haze, musing pleasantly on the time that young Jack Doran would come to him with tears standing in his eyes, and thank him for what he had done. "You saved me, sir, you saved me. Even from myself, you saved me. And though I should live 1,000 years, I shall never be able to thank you adequately, sir." And he would reply, "Have done, my boy, have done. One brave man must ever help another." So the night wore pleasantly on. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Painted Fires by Nellie McClung. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Atul Sharma, Winnipeg, Canada. Chapter 25. Not so pleasantly did the night pass with Jack Doran, who sat in the station waiting for number 8 and listening to the wires telling their never-ending story. A dull, gray station, dusty even when the snow had covered all the dust. A red stove in the middle of the floor, egg-shaped, fluted, and either fireless or red-hot according to the mood of the agent. Torn posters showing palatial white steamers plowing green seas and carrying pleasure-seeking Canadians to tropical lands, all for trifling sums, and return. A bill of sale, where instructions had been given to the auctioneer to spare nothing, ill health the cause of the owner's desire to sell. A stray notice, re a bull pup, answering to the name of Buster, with a reward. A dance and raffle at Bannerman by St. Faith's Ladies' Aid, program and refreshments, and cordial invitation to all. Save the forest poster. The forest is ours. Let us keep it always. John Fernwalt's announcement of his ability to mend shoes. Old country methods and moderate prices. Try me once. Jack came back to his own bitter thoughts, to which the telegraph wires made a weird accompaniment, ghostly and grim. He could see the instrument from where he sat, muttering, tapping, clicking with its mysterious finger, silent for a few moments, then convulsed and shaken with the desire to be understood. He thought of all the suppressed emotions, the heartbreak, anxiety, and fears the wires carried in dead silence along the miles, and how they break into strange tappings here, chokingly alive and articulate. Life was like that, he mused, We all carry our load of emotions, carefully hidden, but we cannot all throw it off at intervals in dots and dashes like the wires. Reaching the city, Jack went to the McDonald Hotel, where he met his partner Keith, whom he had not seen since the night of the recruiting meeting at Peace River. They discussed their plans for the future. "I'm going to have our specimens assayed here at the university, and I will go at once to Victoria to file our claims," said Keith. Jack told him briefly of his domestic trouble. "I believe she is here in the city," he said in conclusion, "and I want to find her. I will not believe a word unless I hear it from her." Keith whistled softly. "This is bad work, boy," he said, "and I sure am sorry. Women are the finest in the world, or the worst. If they're not one, they are the other. When you begin to break off the coupons from your gold mine stock, you'll have a flock of them pursuing you. Anyway." Jack was looking out at the wide view of the winter landscape, with the magnificent river, covered with snow, winding away into the blue distance. "I don't want a flock," he said, "but I do want Helmi. If you knew her, Keith, you would know she couldn't be crooked. She has eyes that were like a little girl's, full of wonder and innocence." "I don't believe there are any innocent girls these days," Keith replied, lighting his pipe for the 20th time. He could never keep his pipe going, and when he sat for half an hour in one place, he had burnt matches strewn around him like confetti around a bride. Keith was a low-set man of very dark complexion, tanned now to a rich mahogany. "My own opinion is that you are well out of it, Jack," he continued, "but I'll admit I'm no judge of women. They can all fool me." "Sometimes I think of enlisting," said Jack. "When I listened to that boy leaning on his crutch, I wanted to go. The other old soak rather spoiled it, though." "Gosh, I liked him," said Keith, grinning. "He told us some of the richest stories I ever heard." "I couldn't stand him and his stories," Jack said with warmth. "He's the sort that make war. He loves it. You can see that. But you'll notice he will never do any of the fighting. It looks as if the thing had to be finished up now that we are in it." Keith was watching Jack closely, even though he was so busy keeping his pipe going. "I'll certainly look after your interest, Jack, if you want to go. I'll file for you on everything I get while you're gone, and I'm going to get right after the potassium deposits and the oil as soon as I get the gold cinched." "I knew you would," said Jack gratefully. "I am not thinking about that." "And I'll do my best to locate the Helmi girl and see that she has plenty." Jack remembered Helmi's outbreak of rage when Keith's name was mentioned, and hastened to say, "I hope I'll find her before I go." So gradually, the thought of enlisting took shape in Jack's mind. It was with him when he stepped into the white bathtub and enjoyed the luxury it afforded, with its shining appointments, snowy towels, foaming soap. But he couldn't forget what Private Crow had told about the dirt, the mud, the lice, the scratchy underwear. He was glad to think of the wealth coming to him from the gold mine, for he craved all the luxuries of life, and he wanted to be able to give them to other people. He loved white sheets, smooth and satiny, and beautiful rugs with deep, rich colorings, music, pictures, but especially did he want these things for Helmi, who had such a love for beauty. No matter where Jack's thoughts began, they would soon come back to Helmi. He wondered if she had got the $200 all right. At first he had thought that he would have to send for it when they were outfitting at Peace River, but Keith sold another share, and then they were all right. He had even written out an order for a friend of Keith's, who offered to advance the money and get it when he went to Eagle Mines. What had he done with that order? Yes, he remembered. Keith got it back from his friend and destroyed it. The first day Jack was in the city, he made a thorough search of all the Chinese places, but without result. When he came to Sam's, he was met by the wily proprietor, who had learned in a hard school that it is foolish to give information. Sam could lay down all his knowledge of English in a fraction of a second. "I not know," all at once became his entire English vocabulary. Sam had been in our law courts. He had listened to many learned friends disagreeing with other learned friends, and he had become somewhat of a learned friend himself. He had one rule: admit nothing, deny everything, remember you were not there when it happened. So when a well-dressed young man came asking for a Finnish girl with red hair, Sam knew nothing. In Sam's limited sphere, the relations between men and women were elemental and simple. Maybe the police wanted his red-haired girl. That might be. Well, Sam did not want to lose her. She was a good girl, honest girl. She rang up the right change. Sam did not usually trust any white girl would change, but he was glad now that he had found one whom he could not catch. For it might be she was honest all the time. No, Sam did not know. Sam did not know anything. Sam did not tell Helmi either. Nice girl, Helmi. If want a fella, she could get plenty. No use getting nice girl all excite. Helmi went back to the Good Eats Cafe one day to see if it would be possible for her to be given longer hours. The $1 a night was not going to be sufficient for her needs. Her room rent was $15 a month, and even at that, she suspected the Corbetts were paying some of it. She would like to go to work at 2 o'clock in the afternoon if Sam could arrange this. He had been away for a few days, and another Chinaman had been in charge. When Helmi arrived, old Sam was at his accustomed place behind the desk, very elegant in a new black suit and white tie. He wore a white flower in his buttonhole and resembled a church usher on Mother's Day. Helmi remembered how they looked at Miss Abby's church. He was very friendly with her and bowed cavalierly over her hand. Helmi had learned to suspect polite men of being drunk, but old Sam was always sober. The cafe, too, was festive in its appearance. Flowers in bloom were on the tables. A drooping fuchsia in the window rained its crimson and purple blossoms down like a spraying fountain, and squares of embroidery hung on the walls. Helmi wondered at the changes. It must be some Chinese holiday, she thought. Sam came around from the desk to greet her, and she noticed further improvement. Sam had false teeth with some gold ones. His nails were daintily manicured and his hands heavily perfumed. "Nice lead-haired girl," he said, shaking her hand sideways. "Good girl. Callie play. Old Sam got nice little white girl now, all his own. Soon she come, my girl, grand girl, Mrs. Sam Lee, drivey big car, my girl." As he spoke, a big gray car with silver mountings drew up to the curb, and a lady in a scarlet suit came out. She came into the Good Eats Cafe, filling the doorway with color, like some strange tropical bird. Helmi's eyes were so dazzled by the vision that in her admiring survey she had not yet reached the face. A shout came from under the drooping black hat, and the beaming lady bore down upon Helmi. "Helmi, my love, come to me. I always knew I would find you." "Rose Lamb?" cried Helmi, breathless with excitement. "Rose, are you out?" "Hush!" cautioned Rose, dimpling and drawing her shoulders up. "I was never in. You and I met at a young ladies' seminary. No tradesmen's daughters allowed, remember? Not that good old Sam minds. He's been in jail, and it makes them broad to go to jail. But for the sake of my social position, mum's the word. Sam, tea for two, please. Sit down, Helmi, and let me look at you. Have you been converted lately? Oh, Lord, do you remember how we were prayed over? I got to be their little pet lamb, pure as the driven snow, but I drifted. Well, where have you been?" Helmi told her. "Married? That's bad. But I knew it. I saw it in you. You were that kind. And your man has sort of been mislaid, temporarily. He's only a minor. Let him go. It's beastly poor pay, I hear." "But I want him to come back," said Helmi. "I love him, Rose." "Ain't that like you, Helmi? Of course you do. And you have a baby, and I suppose you keep it too." "I sure do," said Helmi. Sam Lee had gone into the kitchen, and Helmi, leaning close to Rose, said, "Rose, did you marry old Sam?" "Kid, you've said it," replied the bride. "I sure did. License, ring and all. Sam Lee, widower, Rose Annabel Lamb, spinster, Anglican clergyman doing the job." "Rose, how could you? He is not only a Chinaman, but old, very old. He must be at least 60. 60? Rose almost shouted. "Don't kid yourself. He's 80. I wouldn't look at anyone only 60. He might outlive me. Sam is safe. He'll snuff out like a gentleman. Little Rosie, all alone. Think of it, with some 40,000 bones. How's that?" No good, said Helmi, shaking her head. No good. Kid, I couldn't work. I hate dishwater, and I couldn't scrub. It always made my nose sore. I hate work, and what could I do? If I had lots of money, I'd run straight. Old Sam is not so bad, and the gray car is a pippin. Come and see our house, Helmi. It's swell. Rugs of blue and rose, with one little tea house in the corner. Tapestries in gold blossoms. Lamps of hammered brass. Oh, come and see it. Sam, some more ginger. Thanks, old top. Lots of room for you too, Helmi. I'll give you a room in rose and gray with fresh flowers every morning. Come, Helmi, let's have a little run in the car. I've been pinched once for speeding, but I'm careful now. I want to tell you about what happened after you left. Helmi went with Rose to the car and stepped in after her. The sudden rush of air, the delightful feeling of motion, the sensation of freedom. With these, Helmi's fears fell away. Impulsively, she hugged her friend's arm. Oh, Rose, it's good to see you, she said. Two men on the sidewalk regarded them closely. One watched them with wicked wise eyes, cynical and hard, the only gleam of gladness in them due to his suspicions being verified. The other man's eyes burned with a great sorrow and a bitter disappointment. You see what I said, remarked the first. That woman driving the car is well known in the underworld. Lately she has come here as the mistress of a rich Chinaman. The Finnish girl is one of the gang. As you can see, Mr. Doran, you are well out of it. Jack leaned back against the doorway, sick at heart. Now I want to tell you something, said Major Dowsett, for it was he. That girl has no legal hold on you. Colonel Blackwood did not record the marriage. He knew her history, you see. She has therefore no hold on you, so do not worry about that. Jack turned away without speaking. The loom of life went on with its weaving, but from Helmi's life the golden thread had gone. But of course, the flying shuttles cannot stop to look for ends. The loom of life does the best it can with the threads its shuttles are able to bring, but it takes no responsibility for the pattern. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Painted Fires by Nellie McClung. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Atul Sharma, Winnipeg, Canada. Chapter 26. Mrs. Kalinsky and Mrs. Corbett were having a cup of tea in the latter's big room one afternoon. When Mrs. Corbett had finished her duties as janitor's wife, who could be got by the hour to do out rooms for the tenants. I've turned out Mrs. Rowan and Mrs. Snyder today, given Mrs. Brown a lick and a promise, and put Mrs. Flickdale off until tomorrow, said Mrs. Corbett as she set the peanut butter and strawberry jam on the table, and proceeded to cut slices from the loaf. Mrs. Kalinsky was still waiting. It's a long time, the last month, said Mrs. Corbett soothingly. Sure, every day brings it one day nearer, and it's yourself has everything ready and fine and nothing to do but hop into bed and call the neighbors and good old Dr. Eckhart. I never saw a woman any readier than you are, with the name and all. Mrs. Kalinsky looked very smart in her black satin tea-gown and gold embroidery that her Isidore had bought from the store. She took her neighbor into her confidence. No matter what I could say, mind you, the woman said she paid $70 for it once, and Izzy got it for $15. She wanted $30, but Izzy told her it was the worst thing to sell. Who was wearing tea-gowns now? They was out of date, like leg o' mutton sleeves. And all the time Izzy was thinking of me. I had a red cashmere one with Watteau pleats when our Rachel was coming, and his papa says little Isaac will be served as good, even if it did cost $15 and could be sold for $30 easy. He's that good a man and spares no expense in reason. Mrs. Corbett brought the tea from the kitchen and filled the cups. You and me are lucky women, she said, to have two good men like we have. Ain't some of them the easy-going devils, though? I don't know what to think of Helmi's man, though she sticks up for him and is afraid he's been lost in a storm or drowned in a river. Poor girl. It's a shame to see her having to work in a chinks. But what could the poor girl do? Not one of those dainty ladies would have her. They all had some reason. If she were just a Hebrew girl now, said Mrs. Kalinsky, One could go to the Hebrew Association of Women and they would find a place for her. We would not have any nice white girls of ours working in a Chinese shop and having to take lippy talk from every Harry, Tom, Dickon, and maybe worse. Mrs. Sternborg and Mrs. Swartz are grand on that, and good girls they have found for our people." Mrs. Corbett paused with her saucer halfway to her mouth. "Look at that now. Ain't the Jews wonderful to think of things? We've got grand societies too, and I never once thought of them. Sure, we've got societies. They're all up to their eyes in pneumonia jackets and many-tailed bandages now, and socks for the soldiers. But they're grand women too. When I came here first, I used to take care of the club room at the Y, and I used to see them there milling round. Very civil-spoken women too, and trying to make the world better, and God knows it needs it. I'll go to Mrs. Bell, the old lady, and I'm glad you spoke of this, Mrs. Kalinsky. Maybe we can get a decent place yet for Helmi, though if she takes the baby away, I don't know what I'll do with Rose and Dan." Mrs. Corbett went that evening, after Helmi had gone to work, leaving the baby to the watchful care of Rose, who sat in number 18 to do her lessons. Mrs. Bell was at home, and would speak of Helmi's case at the meeting of the Lloyd George chapter the next day. A week later, a new place was found for Helmi. Mrs. Bell said it was an ideal place, and while $10 a month was very little, still, it was not every place she could have the privilege of keeping her baby, and Mrs. Harriet would be very kind to her. Mrs. Harriet was young and inexperienced, and found her baby a great care. Helmi could mind the two babies, and Mrs. Harriet would do the work. Old Sam was sorry to part with Helmi, and gave her a feather fan. "You come back some day. Old Sam be glad. Good girl. Callie Clay. Teach she make chop suey. Come back. You come see my girl too, and have chop suey." Helmi paid her rent at the North Star, and had $3 left. The Harriet home was a 6-room bungalow on 127th Street, 3 blocks from the car line on 124th Street. It was a little house, low-roofed, square, with but little pitch in the roof and high pillars in front, much too high for the height of the house, giving one the sensation, as Helmi thought, of seeing a cow getting up hind legs first. Rosie and Danny conducted her to the place, Rosie carrying the baby, and Danny helping Helmi with the heavy valise. "I hope you don't like her," said Rosie, "and then you'll come back. I'll bet her baby cries more than ours, and just when you get little Lily asleep, her kid will wake up whining. Well, anyway, Helmi, you can always come back, and we'll manage some way." Helmi kissed her 2 good friends at the back door, but Rosie refused to go until she saw if the lady were at home. "Maybe she's changed her mind," she said, speaking from her experience with ladies, "or has got help, or something has happened. You can't depend on these women in the West End. Ain't that right, Dan? They don't pay their debts either very good. They always say, 'Come back again.' Dan collects for a tailor, and he knows. They don't remember anything less than $5, and when they're stuck for another excuse, they peep out of one of the windows to see who it is, and won't let you in." Mrs. Harriet was in, and had not engaged anyone else, and so the escort had to go home alone, which they did regretfully. Helmi found the house in a state of siege. Confusion reigned everywhere. The invader slept in a baby carriage which filled the greater part of the living room, and when he slept, all noises were muffled. The grandmother, who had been conscripted into service, padded about in her bedroom slippers. The telephone bell was stuffed with paper. No one was admitted to the house, not even the baker. There was a little room off the kitchen where Helmi and Lily were to sleep. It had just room enough to take in the rubber-wheeled carriage. "Oh, I will be so glad to have someone to take this old baby off my hands," said Mrs. Harriet, frankly. "He spoiled last summer for me, but I don't mean to let him spoil this one. Isn't a baby awful? I hope yours is good. Anyway, I can get out now, and believe me, I am going." Mrs. Harriet, having shaken off family cares, resumed her place in her little world. She curled and played bridge, and went to the matinee with her friends, and came home only when everything was over. She was a pretty, plump-faced girl of 23, who had the misfortune to be the only child of adoring parents. "Maudie is not fond of work," her mother often said. But never mind, she'll take to it when she has a house of her own. Young Robert Harriet, who had married her with pomp and circumstance at the first church, believed the same thing. Maudie had been in a terrible rage about the coming of the baby, but her mother fondly believed she would be attached to it when it came. "They make their own place, babies do," she said. "Maudie will be so fond of it, she wouldn't take $1,000,000 for it when she has had it 2 days. But Maudie's friends agreed among themselves that they would hate to offer it to her. The baby was now 2 months old, and the great fountain of mother love which the baby's grandmother had hoped for was still either non-existent or untouched. "She'll take to it when it gets a little older," she would say. "You'll see when it gets cute. Maudie will take to it." Helmi knew that cats sometimes refuse their young, but she did not know that it could be true of human beings. In a week, the siege seemed to be lifted. Long lines of washing had been fluttering on the clothes reel. Closets were tidied, floors polished, the old baby put on a regular way of living. Mrs. Harriet had won the ladies' points composition at the rink, and her friends had told her she was looking years younger. One night, when the Harriets were going for a drive, Mr. Harriet wanted to take Helmi too, and her baby. "That girl hasn't been out of the house since she came," he said. "Ask her to come, Maudie." Maudie laid a well-manicured finger on her neatly carmine lip. "Hush, Bob," she said. "Don't spoil her. Leave well enough alone. Come on, we'll take the Bunnings. They have no kids to want to come. Hurry, Bob." When they were in the car, Maudie finished the conversation. "Helmi is doing well, but don't fuss her up by taking her out. They get to know too much. Now Mrs. Bell, when she spoke to me, said I would have to get someone to wash. Helmi wouldn't be able to do the washing, especially the hanging out of the clothes, on account of nursing her baby. She might catch cold. But Bob, she does it and washes beautifully. I just kept quiet. So we're saving $2 a week there. Now how's that? Am I a good wife for a poor man? I'll say I am. Those foreign girls are strong as horses. Well, she's good to the baby anyway, but don't spoil her for heaven's sake. The more you do for people, the more they expect. Take it from me." To which Mr. Harriet replied, "I bet she'd like a ride, though. She's only a kid. She's younger than you are, and I think she looks pretty pale and tired sometimes." "Look here," said his plump little wife, asserting her dignity. "Who is running the house?" And when she said it, she looked so utterly sweet and plump and pink and white, so much like a spoiled but very pretty child, that her husband kissed her and forgot all about Helmi. Helmi had a friend in the bread man who gave her snatches of news from the outside world. The soldiers from out at the exhibition grounds were going away soon. They would go direct to England, to Salisbury Plains. His boy was with them, as good a boy as ever stepped. But he would go, a chip off the old block. He had been in South Africa in the war, was mentioned in dispatches too. But nobody knows anything about it now. The world soon forgets. These soldiers will be forgot too, for all the bands are playing for them now. Helmi was not unhappy. She had pleasure in her work and in caring for little Lily, who grew lovelier every day. The Harriet baby was a heavy jowl child who slept well and cried profoundly. "Has she taken to it yet?" the grandmother asked each time she came. From her room, Helmi could look north to the railway tracks and see the Peace River train come in as it crossed the street, moving silently along like a square black jointed snake. She found herself watching for it every Tuesday and Saturday. It was queer that Sim had not answered her letters. One night in April, when Mr. and Mrs. Harriet were away to a dance, Roland, their baby, grew suddenly ill. The usual symptoms: little hot hands, fevered breath, and restless, tossing head. Helmi was walking the floor with him when the parents came in at 2:00 in the morning. "Lay him down and let him cry," said the mother as she threw her cloak on the dining room table. "It's his teeth. All kids have it. You're spoiling him." "You'd better send for the doctor," said Helmi. "See how red he is. I am afraid of tuli roko, the red fever." "Nonsense." Maudie Harriet had just come from the McDonald. She had danced every dance, and the exhilaration of it was still in her brain. The idea of this Finn girl saying the doctor should be brought. Helmi was frightened. The baby's eyes were burning and rolled uncertainly, and the night was heavy with the sudden heat of spring. "Please do get a doctor, Mrs. Harriet," she pleaded. "It's bad, this sudden sickness. Sometimes it brings on convulsions, and babies die." Mrs. Harriet took another look at the baby and felt his head and his hands. "Oh, he's all right. His head is a little hot, but his hands are cool. Feel." The fingertips were cold. "Well, I'm going to bed. I've had a hard day, and there's another ahead of me tomorrow. I don't see that there's any sense running up a bill with a doctor when there's no need. All kids get sick sometimes, and the less notice you take of them, the better." The next day, Lily grew hot and restless, and Helmi sent for a doctor. In 3 days, the doctor declared it to be scarlet fever, and the Harriets decided that both children should go to the isolation hospital. "Let me stay and keep them," pleaded Helmi. "I cannot let my baby go. She will fret for me. She will die among strangers. Please, Mrs. Harriet, let me stay. I will work for you for a year, for 5 years, for nothing, if you will let me stay and keep her. And I will nurse Roland too." Helmi was rocking herself from side to side in her anguish. Mrs. Harriet did not hesitate a moment. "No, Helmi, we can't do that. They'll be all right at the hospital. It's the right place." "But my little Lily will die. I nurse my Lily." "Well, you'll have to wean her. They'll look after that. I can't help it anyway, so don't stare at me." Helmi sprang to her feet and shook her mistress fiercely. "I care. I love my baby. You do not love yours. You can send yours. If he dies, you will be glad. If my Lily dies, I die too. Let me keep both. Please, please." "Say, Bob, listen to this. Wouldn't it jar you? Helmi, you have your nerve. Now listen, they are both going. I guess if the isolation hospital is good enough for Roland Harriet, it will do for Lily, so cut out all the fireworks and get them ready." Plump and pink and white, with a baby smile, was Maudie Harriet, the petted child and wife, but hard and cruel as any toothless old crone. Both mothers rode in the ambulance to the hospital, and strangely enough it was Mrs. Harriet who became hysterical when the nurse took her baby from her. The brown-eyed nurse who had received Lily read the misery in Helmi's white face, and patted her shoulder kindly. "I do not think your baby will have it very hard. She is a lovely little thing, and looks quite strong. Don't worry over her, because we have splendid success with our babies here. She will have every care, I promise you. No, she will not fret much." Helmi kissed her hand with a rapt look in her eyes, but she could not speak. Her heart would have broken when she saw Lily carried into the fever ward, away from her, with the door shut between them, if the kindly touch of the nurse's hand had not been laid on her shoulder. The hand was warm, human and strong, and its touch went with her when she went down the dark stairs to the ambulance which waited at the door. Mrs. Harriet was weeping violently, but Helmi sat tight-lipped and pale, but tearless. The red cross on the frosted glass of the ambulance door held her eyes with gruesome fascination. To her excited imagination it seemed as if it were painted with blood. When returning, they were stopped at First Street by the closing of the black and white gates, for the afternoon train was going out, a special carrying the soldiers. The station platform swarmed with people, and a band blared its music. Helmi hated the sound of it. How could any band play when there was so much trouble in the world, and her Lily so sick? Once, when she was a child at home, she had drawn her hand across the plastered wall, and some of the plaster had caught below her fingernails, making her sick with a horrible sensation. The band music brought the feeling back to her again. There were flags on the train, hanging out of the windows, fluttering like little red wounded things licking at the side of the car like red tongues. Helmi shivered as she watched them. From the window of the ambulance she could see the swarming crowds, but the train hid from her view the farewell scenes. As the train moved slowly out, Helmi could see the faces gliding past her. Most of the soldiers were at the windows on the side next the station platform, waving to friends. Just as the last car went by, gathering up speed now, one man sat moodily looking out of the north window, with eyes that saw nothing. Helmi, from where she sat in the ambulance, was not more than 6 feet from him as he passed. When his face came into view, she beat upon the glass like a mad thing, screaming, "Jack! Jack! Look at me!" But though she saw him so plainly, he did not see her, and the train went on its way. Helmi's voice, like the sobbing of many others, was lost in the blare of the bands. The next day, Helmi went to the North Star rooming house, walking wearily up the stairs to number 19. Mrs. Corbett opened the door to her as she had 4 months before, and again the anguish in the girl's face told its own story. "My God, Helmi, is she dead?" asked Mrs. Corbett. Helmi sat down before she answered. "Is that all? Sure, that's nothing. Every child takes scarlet fever. They're grand at the isolation hospital. I know big Miss Shaw up there, as grand a girl as ever went on rubber heels. Cheer up, Helmi. The little pet will be all right, please God. I thought the gypsies had stolen her by the look on your face, and I'm glad it's nothing worse than scarlet fever." "My man has gone to war," said Helmi brokenly. "I saw him on the train. He did not see me. He does not care about me." Mrs. Corbett paused. This was a harder complication than the illness of little Lily, and for a moment even this determined optimist was floored. But only for a moment. "Well, sure, when he's there you know where he is, and it's noble of him to go, Helmi. Remember that. Now here, dear, take a cup of tea. Yes, you can. A person can always take a cup of tea, no matter who's gone, and it makes life look a little brighter. Drink it down, dear, and have another. You look better now. Don't get down to mourning, Helmi. There's nothing happened yet that can't come right. Remember that. And your darling, blessed child, with God's blessing, will come through the fever, just the way we all did, and your man will come back again." "But he doesn't want me any more. I know now. The magistrate has turned him against me. I said I would kill that man, and I will." "No, dear, no. You mustn't talk of killing anyone. God will deal with the wicked in his own good time. You come with me to the army, and you'll find comfort in God's love. No killing, though, Helmi, that's bad. And see, dear, I was forgetting there's 2 letters for you. Just came yesterday." Helmi took them eagerly and opened one. "It's a mistake," she said listlessly. "See, there's money in it. No one would send me money. It has been opened too and sealed up again." Mrs. Corbett took it out of her hand. "It's for you, right enough," she said. "Here's your name on it. It's a separation allowance for $15 from Arthur Warner, Eagle Mines." "I do not know anyone called Arthur Warner," said Helmi. "Well, he knows you, and that's better anyway. He wants you to have the money, and you're a fool if you don't take it. Read the other one. Maybe it will tell." Helmi opened it and read. It was the letter Jack had opened at Eagle Mines. Helmi read it aloud to Mrs. Corbett. "I know now," she said. "He is a good man, that Mr. English. I will take the money. He means good by me." "Sure he does," agreed Mrs. Corbett. "He seems like a good fellow, a good Englishman, and there's nothing finer in the world. Now, Helmi dear, I want you to lie down in Rosie's bed and have a good sleep, poor child. Now you'll be having trouble with your breasts, cutting off the baby so sudden. So I'll run in and borrow Mrs. Kalinsky's breast pump. She's the grandest woman that for a neighbor, for she has everything from a bookjack to curtain stretchers. You see, in their business they get all sorts, and he gives her the run of the store. But have your sleep now, honey." But Helmi's thoughts were not of sleep. She had a duty to perform, and which she had no desire to evade. One great purpose dominated her heart and cried aloud for fulfillment. The money which had come to her had made it possible. When Mrs. Corbett came back, Helmi was gone. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Painted Fires by Nellie McClung. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Atul Sharma, Winnipeg, Canada. Chapter 27. Dr. St. John lay one evening on the Chesterfield in his den, before a cheerful wood fire. Ava was entertaining her Wednesday night bridge, and tinkles of laughter, high-pitched and nervous, shot through the velvety murmurs of conversation. The doctor had listened to such conversations many times, and knew the little razor-sharp points of antagonism it held, and which seemed to pop out like needles from a squeezed pincushion, thin, sharp, unexpected, for the temper of the guests was uncertain. They had no community of purpose. They were pursuing no particular trend of thought. They were time-killers, sensation hunters. He knew the very odor of the room, sachet powder, cigarette smoke, flesh of women too scantily clad, perfume heavy and exotic, a sweet smell, yet not wholesome, like good apples wanting air. The doctor could see it all like a picture, the dark brown background, shot through here and there with little flashes of pale lightning that began in nothing and ended in nothing, led nowhere. Ava's friends met, chattered, parted, met again. No one any wiser or better, more inspired to nobler living. They were doing nothing wrong. It was even worse than that, he thought. They were doing nothing. The doctor recalled that it was a Wednesday night. His mother always went to prayer meeting on Wednesday night. How Ava would laugh if anyone mentioned prayer meeting, and yet human nature was the same. But somehow it was getting off the track. His mother had spent years on a treadmill, her days laid out for her in regular lines. Work stared at her from morning till night, and she did it, and held her head above it all. She was always sweet-tempered, interesting, sympathetic. Ava, having nothing to do, did nothing, and doing nothing, degenerated, grew shallow, selfish, cross-grained, and hard. In his struggling days, Dr. St. John had dreamed of having a house like this, and a wife who would help him by her sympathy and understanding. But something had spoiled his dream. He had the house and the practice, and someone to spend his money, but in some ways he had been to blame. He had been too easy, indulgent, and foolish. Ava and her friends laughed at him, he knew. The ease with which Ava was able to deceive him furnished many a good story for the lively company which sat at the bridge tables. It was when his mother came to visit him a year ago that the doctor began to see Ava as she was. He had tried to imagine what she would be like when she was as old as his mother, who at 65 was as alert and eager-minded as ever, doing many of the things she had wanted to do all her life. To Ava, she was a puzzle. How could anyone get such joy from going to the New Year rally of Sunday school children? Or why did anyone get up early on Sunday morning to go for a walk? Ava's studied politeness toward his mother irritated him, and it was a relief when his mother went over to Miss Abby's to finish her visit. So passed another dream. He had so often thought of what a pleasure it would be to have his mother visit him. She was such a good sport, his mother. Another matter was weighing heavily on the doctor's mind. More surgeons were needed at the front. Why should he stay here at ease? Dr. Brown, his young partner, was seriously considering the matter. Dr. Brown had a wife and children, a wife who loved him. Dr. Brown had said that he would go, he being the younger man. That did not matter. Dr. Brown was needed here more than he, who had no one depending on him. Ava would be happier without him, so long as the money held out. These thoughts occupied the doctor's mind as he lay listening to the commotion across the hall. The first year of their married life, when he began to see that Ava had no intention of entering into his life seriously, he was sorely hurt. He had had dreams of domestic happiness since he was 16, and it is the loss of a dream that hurts the most. Now he was still hurt, but he was critical. When criticism begins to fill the mind, the tenderness of love is over. Dr. St. John would not have been critical of his wife if she had chosen to follow some profession. He would have liked that. He did not believe that every woman had to be run in the domestic mold, making the coffee and ironing shirts. Anyone could do that. But the companionship, the good fellowship of a wife, how he craved it. And now that craving was slowly turning to resentment. Other men had wives. He had a queen of chatter, a hoarder of trinkets, a bridge player, a tea drinker. The telephone rang. Yes, it is Dr. St. John. Who is speaking? Jack Doran. Ava's brother, on your way through? Come along, yes, we are at home. I'll drive down for you. Only 30 minutes. Grand Trunk. I'll be there. Yes, Ava will come too. The doctor hurried into the living room and spoke to Ava. Jack is at the station. Get on your things, he said. My car is at the door. Leave the crowd here. We will all go, cried one girl with very bare shoulders. I want to see Ava's good-looking brother. Let's give him a regular send-off. The crowd arose flutteringly, all chattering. There was something particularly irritating to the doctor in their idleness, their gaiety, their lack of seriousness. Stay here, he said curtly. Jack Doran has no desire to be met by a crowd of strangers for whom he cares nothing. He wants to see his sister. Ava turned on him indignantly. Well, I like that, she said. Remember, a station is a public place. Anyone can go. Come on, kids, every one of you. The doctor took his wife's arm with a suddenness that surprised her, and said, Hurry, Ava. Have you no sense? You have no right to be rude to my friends, said Ava peevishly, when they were on their way to the station. You acted abominably just now. Oh, forget it, the doctor said, and try to get a serious thought in your mind for once. Your only brother is going to war, and the chances are against your ever seeing him again. Have you nothing to say to him? Forget that cackling gang for half an hour. Their feelings are not hurt. Ava looked at him in speechless amazement. Jack had hoped that he might see his sister and the doctor alone. He wanted to tell his sister about Helmi. The boy's heart craved companionship. He must tell someone. But the whole crowd swarmed around him with their incoherent gaiety, their senseless chatter, and the few minutes went by uselessly. The doctor was furious, and it was against Ava that his rage was directed. Here was her only brother going away, and she had not a serious thought in her head, not one loving, personal word for him. The doctor took Jack's hand at the last as they stood at the steps of the train. I am going over too, Jack, he said. It's going to be a long fight, and we will all be needed. I cannot stand back and see other men go. I am proud of you, Jack. Can I do anything for you? A great impulse to tell the doctor came to Jack, but the conductor was calling and the train bell was ringing. I wish I could have had a good talk with you, Jack said as the train began to move. That night, when her company had gone, Ava came into the doctor's room. His light was still burning, and she knew he was not asleep. Ava, sinuous and graceful, in a light gown of cream satin, was determined to check what was the first sign of insubordination in her husband. Her married friends assured her that if a man is led away with an exhibition of temper or crossness, he will be worse the next time. So Ava had her mind made up to be very haughty and coldly proud. She would forgive him, but only after a distinct understanding. Well, what have you to say? She asked him, with the queenly manner that had never failed. Nothing, he answered. Only that it is time you were in bed. Do you mean to say that, after insulting my guests? The doctor laid down his book. If your guests had any sense, which they have not, they would have stayed here and let you and me go alone. They don't know Jack and care nothing for him. They raced to the station because it was something to do, something to relieve the dullness of their vacant minds. I told you to hurry if you wanted to see your brother. Now you can be as hurt over it as you like. I am tired of trying to understand you, and have come to the conclusion that there is nothing to understand. In fact, you have ceased to interest me. Ava had not expected this. What do you mean? She said at last. Just what I said. Selfish people pay for their selfishness in the end, though they may be able to run on credit for a long time. The world is at war, Ava, but you do not know it. While you and your overfed friends were eating and drinking downstairs, boys were dying in mud and cold to save the world. Brave boys like Jack. Nurses were binding up shrapnel wounds while shells fell around them. Refugees were pouring into England to be cared for by the women of England. No, Ava, your type might last a long time in peace, but it shows up badly in time of war. Ava was looking at him now through half-closed lids. Dull anger burned in her eyes. You are no longer a child, Ava, though I can hardly say you are a woman. You are a perfect form to hang clothes on, and a very graceful dancer, and a very free spender on yourself, and if you thought you could get away with it right now, you would give a violent exhibition of anger. But something tells you it would be quite useless. You will never be an old woman, Ava. Don't be afraid of that. Old women are patient, kindly, motherly people, ready to help, ready to warn, anxious, perhaps too anxious. You know the type, and utterly despise them. You were quite ashamed of my dear old mother when she came to visit us. She was so old-fashioned and quaint to you and your friends. No, you will never be an old woman, Ava. In another 15 years you will be a stale novelty." She turned and left him without a word. Reaching her room, she flung herself across the bed and wept tears of sheer vexation. The next day, the doctor told his wife that he had enlisted for service overseas. Ava hoped and expected right to the last minute that he would apologize and beg to be forgiven, but she was disappointed, and the hardest part of it was that he did not seem to care. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Painted Fires by Nellie McClung. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Atul Sharma, Winnipeg, Canada. Chapter 28. The people of Bannerman have not forgotten April 25th, 1915. The day began peacefully enough, with only a reddish tinge in the sunshine to mark it from other days, and that blinding heat which seems more oppressive in April than in July. The spring had come early in northern Alberta, and now the budding of the earth was advancing with feverish haste. The red tassels of the poplars were paling into feathery gray, and already some were to be found littering the woodland paths. Their work was done. They could take their rest. Of all the spring birds that had come back to gladden the land, the crows were most in evidence, for they had come in thousands from the south, filling the air with their clamor. In every flock that came, a noisy minority seemed to dominate, sometimes dividing from the company to seek their own way, and then, finding their following not so great as they had expected, returning noisier than ever to demand that another vote be taken, because the first one had not been constitutional. Vastly entertaining is the crow, and full of caprice that marks him for a blood brother of the human family. But he is welcomed by the northern dwellers, not because of himself or his habits, which are reprehensible, but because he is a portent of the spring. The willows that grew beside the river were blushing as the sap rose, green, yellow, or red, according to their kind, and the roads began to whiten with the fuzz from the aspens. But on this 25th day of April, there arose out of the west a sheer black cliff of cloud into the boundless blue, a thick, deep cloud, in which silent lightnings played, and as the day went on, it shoved up higher and higher into the sky, until at 3 o'clock it was ready to cover the sun. During this time, the heat had not abated. The air grew heavy and oppressive. It was the sort of day when horses break into foamy sweat, and people feel cross-grained, clammy, irritable, and full of aches and pains, which they attribute to the weather. The edge of the cliff had a whitish color at 4 o'clock when the sun had gone under, and all the trees were standing still expectantly, as if bracing themselves for something which they were unable to help. In the gathering gloom, the houses in Bannerman, grouped around the station, look more than ever like cats about to spring. The clouds are rolling now, with white lines on their billows, and there is a distant rumble of thunder, like the roar of a faraway city. All day the rain clouds threaten and thunder growls, but it is not until night has fallen that the change comes. The crows that have been sitting like birds of ill omen, humped up on the trees and ready, fly further back into the bush, as if in dread. On the train coming to Bannerman sits Helmi, very pale, very determined, with a purpose so terrible she does not look at her fellow passengers, for the fear is on her that they might divine her errand and try to dissuade her from it. She has made a vow of vengeance, and she will keep it. Why should she spare the man who has wrought so much evil in her life? There is a burning, torturing pain in her heart that only revenge can ease. And as she sits at the window, looking out into the gathering storm, she gloats over the scene. She will come in upon him as he sits at his littered table, the dirty, grimy old man who kept so safely the lying newspaper, guarding it, hoarding it to do her harm. Other things he lost in the confusion and untidiness of his ugly den, but this he treasured safe, and showed it to her Jack, poisoning his mind against her. And now her Jack had gone overseas, angry and bitter, to be killed. And little Lily, when the fever came on her, had no home where she could be nursed back to life. No home, poor little precious Lily, with her silky brown hair and soft little caressing lips. The fever in her breast when she thought of Lily burned like 1,000 red-hot needles, until the perspiration broke in beads on her face. She would see the color fade from her enemy's face when fear gripped his wicked old heart. She had thought of it often since she saw Jack's face gliding away from her. She would see the color go in patches from his face, and he would beg for mercy when he saw the gleaming barrel of the revolver, beg and whimper and call upon his God. Wild strains of blood in Helmi's heart were crying to her to strike and be avenged, to strike and not to spare, and the pain, the horrible drawing, twisting pain around her heart grew more maddening every moment, and in every pang and spasm that tore her was a tongue that cried, "Revenge." Once, Helmi thought of God, when a flare of lightning lit up all the countryside, revealing farmhouses ghostly white, and bending trees that crippled before the rushing wind. God, a lot he cared. God was with the magistrate and let him live secure while her Jack went out with a bitter heart to die, and little Lily tossed in her fever with no mother to comfort her. Helmi had ceased to reason and ceased to fight. She only felt. The primitive passions were ablaze in her. She had been robbed of her mate and her child. Red murder gleamed in her eyes. When the train stopped at Bannerman, the storm was at its height. The wind had the whine of stretched wires in it, and whistled across the deserted platform with a horrible, hissing sound. The night was inky black, with bursts of lightning blinding her eyes, and continuous bellows of thunder, like 100 fire engines roaring past, shutting out every other sound. Helmi knew her way as if by instinct. In the lightning's revealing flashes, the house she sought was easily found. She was breathing now like a person with pneumonia, her nostrils quivering like a wolfhound's when he had his quarry at bay. The revolver was in her hand, and in each flash of the lightning it gleamed like a blinding searchlight. Each chamber was loaded, for Helmi intended to do her work completely. She reached the veranda steps, remembering the one that was broken, carefully making no noise, and stood at the uncurtained window looking in. The man she sought sat at his table with a glass and bottle beside him. A roar of thunder made the bottle tremble on the tin tray and rattled the bricks in his chimney. He started and looked toward the window, though Helmi had made no sound. Helmi moved a step nearer and tapped on the glass. She wanted him to know, to see. She wanted to see the cringing fear. She wanted him to beg, to plead. He came over to the window and he must have seen her face, white and awful in the darkness, for he reeled back in fright with a scream of horror. Then came a crash, a shuddering, sickening crash, with blinding blue lights that seemed to strike at Helmi's eyes like 1,000 furies. There was a sound of crashing timber and a confusion that flung Helmi to her knees. When she opened her eyes and looked through the window, she saw her enemy lying dead on the floor, his face livid, his eyes wide open, full of terror. When Helmi came to herself, she was running through the storm on feet shod with fright, running as if all the fiends of the night were in pursuit, the sky opening and shutting with dazzling lights and blinding darkness, night voices screaming, and louder than all, her own heart pounding in her ears. Sometimes she fell, rising to her feet again. Sometimes she felt a sudden blow, as if a crushing tree had struck her as it fell, but always her fear drove her on. She had no sense of fatigue as she ran on, and no plan of flight, but a strange homing instinct led her in the direction of Eagle Mines. Even in her hysteria and frenzy, her feet carried her toward the little house where she had been loved and secure. Then came the rain, a furious pelting rain that seemed to fall in drowning sheets of water. Every time the heavens opened with the bursts of thunder, another downpour drenched the earth. Suddenly, Helmi was aware that some animal was running beside her, and in a flash of lightning she saw the sable collie, her breast showing ghostly white against the blackness of the night. The nearness of something warm and living gave Helmi courage, and falling beside the dog she clasped her arms around it in a sudden passion of weeping. The animal licked her hot face soothingly, whimpering softly, and with strange comfort in its almost human tenderness. Her wet clothes hung on her now like heavy weights. The dog ran on ahead with encouraging barks, and Helmi following begged the animal not to leave her alone in the darkness. A great weariness came over Helmi now, and a growing fear that her strength was leaving her, but the dog was bounding back to her every few moments, and urging her as plainly as a dog could to come on a little further. Suddenly, at the mouth of the cave, black and terrible, the dog stopped and pulled her by the hand. Helmi followed blindly into the midnight blackness, into which even the lightning could not penetrate. She found something soft beneath her feet, and stooping down, found a bed of hay, dry and comfortable, and on it she fell, grateful to be out of the lashing fury of the storm. The storm still roared in her ears, and the fury of the rain filled the cave with a sound like a roaring cataract. Helmi slept the sleep of utter exhaustion, for when she awakened, the gray dawn was showing at the mouth of the cave. She looked around for the dog, but she was gone. The pain in her breast was like 1,000 knives twisting and torturing her, and a cry of utter anguish broke from her lips. Then she remembered the horror of the night before, and the terrible deed she had done. She saw again that face of fright, and heard the scream. She went to the mouth of the cave, and saw below her the river, running so fair and peaceful and serene. The early morning light, platinum gray, was lying gently on the river's bosom, from which soft little veils of mist were ascending. Helmi shrank back from it in fright, remembering the man who had buried his troubles in its treacherous depths. She clung to the side of the cave, pleading with the river not to tempt her. Watching its current, she seemed to see Jack's face again, gliding away from her. Then came little Lily's face, so cool and peaceful and smiling, with no more fever or pain. And an irresistible impulse to cool her burning, tortured breasts in the quiet green waters of the river drove her forward. For one brittle moment she swayed toward the stream. Then something bounded against her, throwing her backward to the grass. And her friend of the night before was beside her, whimpering, with a tenderness that Helmi knew, for it spoke a universal language. She crawled back in the cave, wide awake now, but writhing in her misery. Then came Cleo the dog with something in her mouth, which she laid in Helmi's arms. A little furry, cuddly puppy, with a fat little body and cool, soft, eager, questioning lips. When Helmi awakened, with a brain cleared of her midnight terrors and a body eased of its pain, she noticed the revolver, which through all her mad flight she had clutched in her hand. Horribly it recalled to her the madness of the terrible night and the loathsome deed that she had done. And yet, now that her brain was clearer, she could not recall that she had really fired the weapon. Her hand had been on the trigger when the lightning came. She sprang toward it eagerly, for it could tell her what she wanted to know. Opening the chamber with trembling hand, she found every cartridge was in its place. Then the soul of Helmi was born anew in thankfulness to God, and in a faith in his goodness that never again wavered, for God had saved her from sin. God had intervened to save her when her heart was furthest from him. God was her friend. He loved her. He would not let her sin. With his own arm he had saved her. Helmi went to the opening of the cave and drank in the beauty of the morning. The sun had just come over the edge of the earth, sending a sheen of gold and rose along the top of the mist that filled the valley below. As she watched, enraptured in her newfound gladness, the mist began to form into wisps and threads that curled and rose over the surface of the river, their upper ends twisting and thinning into the air. A song burst from Helmi's heart, a song of gladness and love and faith, a song that the Blue Book had taught her. When the mists have rolled in splendor from the beauty of the hills, and the sunshine falls in gladness on the rivers and the rills. There was a whimper beside her. Cleo had come out of the cave. Helmi fell on her knees beside her and kissed her honest forehead. "Cleo, Cleo," she cried, "the dog that God sent." End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Painted Fires by Nellie McClung. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Atul Sharma, Winnipeg, Canada. Chapter 29. Helmi reached her own house that morning before the people of Eagle Mines were stirring. It was a sweet morning, without a trace of the storm of the night before, only that the air was washed clean and tasted cool in the mouth like a drink of spring water. She walked with her old sprightliness, and without a single trace of fatigue. Cleo followed with one pup in her mouth, and Helmi carried the other two. The door of the house was not locked, and Helmi soon had a fire burning and a pot of porridge cooking for herself and the dog. The house showed the traces of the hunting parties that had made it their abode, and from the fact that they had left the house dirty and littered, Helmi knew that they were not real hunters, but only city men out looking for game. The true hunter will leave everything as he finds it. This is the law of the wilderness. But in Helmi's heart this morning, there was no resentment as she swept and scrubbed. She had received so much from God that she could easily forgive any of his children, and as she worked, she sang. When the porridge was cooked and the condensed milk poured over it, she called Cleo, who had stayed outside until she was invited to enter. "Come in, Cleo," she said. "My house is yours. You and I will never part, and your pups are welcome too. Come on." Cleo came in with a pup in her mouth, smiling as broadly as she could without altogether dropping the pup. The dog's hunger was pathetic, all the more because it tried so hard not to appear ravenous. This was evidently her first good meal for several days. The puppies, tired out by their adventurous night, were soon fast asleep in a box in which Helmi had placed an old coat of Jack's, and in which they curled up into an indistinguishable mass of sable and white wool, with only one little round head showing. When Cleo had eaten her breakfast, she stood at attention, her eyes fixed on Helmi's face, as if she were trying to read her mind. Helmi patted the dog's head. "Take a sleep, Cleo," she said kindly. "When I get my house cleaned up and my clothes dried, I will tell you all my plans. I do not know where we are going to live, you and I and our families, but I know we are going to live together. I heard many times in the city that no one wanted a girl with a baby, so I suppose a girl with a baby and a dog and 3 pups is not wanted either. But still I have faith in God, Cleo. He always helps. Now lie down and be happy. We have enough here for a few days." Life had changed for Helmi. The demon of revenge which had embittered her heart had been laid to rest by the hand of God, her friend. In her simple theology, God had actually reached down his hand through the blackness of the storm and struck the magistrate dead, because he had brought such evil upon her, and to prevent her from committing the crime of murder. God would be her friend forevermore. She would trust him now, whatever came. She had no more fears for her baby. Lily was in God's keeping, God and the brown-eyed nurse who had spoken so kindly to her. After a couple of hours of vigorous work, Helmi had her house spotless again. Then she lay down to sleep, for a delicious weariness had come over her, and with it a sense of security and peace such as she had never known in all her life before. "Home in God," she murmured to herself drowsily. "Now I can sleep." It was the middle of the afternoon when Helmi wakened. Cleo was sitting beside her, watching her. The pups were still sleeping. She sat up, shaking out her golden hair. The fire had died down, but the house was pleasantly warm. Outdoors, the sun shone brilliantly, and Helmi went out to inhale the delectable odors of spring. How she had missed this in the city. But here it was as poignantly sweet as ever. The wind from the river brought to her the medicinal tang of the balm of Gilead, pungent and healing, and Helmi's heart responded to it with a throb of love. For she remembered the salve her mother used to make of the buds, boiled with clean white lard on the stove and strained through a white cloth and put away in little glass pots for use all the year. As she breathed in the odor reminiscently, from the woods behind the station came the liquid notes of the meadowlark. The heavy rain had washed the roots of the old dead grass into the ground, leaving the bold young shoots showing, and the air had such a balmy mildness that Helmi was content just to sit and breathe it and watch the clouds, clear and white, like lamb's wool, sailing overhead in the limitless blue. She wanted to sing a song of the passing winter, with all its strength of frost and weight of snow, its frozen rivers and leafless trees, for every budding tree and springing flower and caroling bird was singing it too. She remembered a song Mrs. St. John used to sing, which she said was an old-fashioned thing, but she sang it to please the doctor, who liked the old songs best. Bluebird, true bird, bird with the golden wing, do you bring me a letter, or do you bring me a ring? Helmi brought out a chair, and sitting on it, nursing her knees, she sang in perfect happiness. She had $4 in her pocket, a sick baby in the isolation hospital, a dog with 3 pups to whom she had promised food and shelter, a husband who apparently had deserted her, not a relative nearer than Finland. But she sang a song of hope and love and spring, looking into the blue sky above her, for in her heart there was the peace which passeth all understanding. Mrs. McMahon, on her way to the store, saw Helmi sitting at the end of the house and heard her singing, and forthwith forgot that she had left an oven full of pies. "Helmi," she called as she came nearer, out of breath in her hurry, "what is wrong with you? Have you come back?" Helmi quickly rose up to greet her. "There is nothing wrong, Mrs. McMahon. I'm all right. I'm fine. I'm happy, that's all." "But Helmi, where is your child?" Mrs. McMahon was prepared to show a strong, if somewhat belated interest in Helmi's baby. "She is all right too," Helmi said. "She is in the isolation hospital with scarlet fever, but is doing well and will be out in a few weeks." Mrs. McMahon heard the news with doleful forebodings. "Oh, Helmi, don't set your heart on her if she has scarlet fever. It always leaves something behind it, deafness or blindness or something." Helmi resisted an impulse to laugh. "Oh, I don't think so," she said. "She will be all right. I feel sure she will be well. I am not worried." Helmi's cheerfulness seemed most untimely, nor could she explain it to Mrs. McMahon. There was a greater bar between them now than even that of language. "Well, it's grand to take things as easy as you do, Helmi, I must say. Now, when my children were little, they had the fever too, all together. Not very bad, but I worried. Mr. McMahon, no, it was Mr. Bush I had then, scolded me for crying all the time. But I couldn't help it. My, how I cried. He could not understand a mother's heart, of course. But no doubt girls are different now. I was so conscientious. I suppose in a way you were glad to get away from the baby for a while. Well, it was different with me. I slaved for mine, but it doesn't pay. Are you going to stay? No? Going back, are you? City life is too much for girls these days. Picture shows attract them. Well, in the midst of life we are in death. Remember that, Helmi, and don't put your trust in worldly pleasures. Did you hear what happened to the magistrate at Bannerman last night?" In her happiness, Helmi had not been thinking of the magistrate. Startled by Mrs. McMahon's inquiry, she could only say, "Do you mean Colonel Blackwood?" "Yes, the same one. The one that forgot to put it down in his book. He won't forget no more. He was struck with lightning." "How do you know?" "He was found lying on his back, stone dead, and his chimney all knocked down, and his eyes wide open." Helmi shuddered. She knew just how the eyes looked. It gave me such a turn when I heard it, and I ain't been so well anyway. My stomach's up on me again, Helmi. I believe I'll have to go home and see a doctor. I can't trust any of the doctors here. They haven't got the papers like they hold in the States. All my trouble is inward, Helmi, and I don't believe these doctors could ever understand it." "I am sorry," said Helmi. "I wish I could help you." In her newfound happiness, Helmi could understand Mrs. McMahon and her pitiful little striving for praise and applause, her sordid life, her little meannesses, her petty jealousies, her dull grey outlook, smote Helmi's heart now with pity. "You're a good girl, Helmi, no matter what you've done or haven't done, and I've a good mind to take you back, no matter what anyone says." Helmi laughed as she patted her visitor's arm. "Where is good old Sim?" she asked quickly. "Is he still here? He did not write to me." "Oh, didn't you hear? He had an accident in the mine and hurt his leg. He is still in the hospital, so I guess that's why. They say he'll never be able to night watch again. You know I miss him too, and wish now that I hadn't been quite so sharp on him. Well, won't you stay, Helmi?" "No, I am going to the city," said Helmi. "But I want you to feed Cleo and the pups for me. There's plenty of scraps from your table, and they can sleep in my house. I'll ask Bill Larson to shut the door at night and open it in the morning, and when Lily is better I will come back. You will like my Lily, Mrs. McMahon. She can smile now and play with her hands." Mrs. McMahon sighed. "I am always sorry when I see a girl baby. Life is so hard for us women." Helmi got another letter at the post office, a letter from Arthur Warner, enclosing another $15 check. He was over in France now, on active service, and the letter was written as he sat waiting for the signal to go over the top in an attempt to capture a German position. "It is good to have someone to write to, Helmi, someone who cares, and I want you to do something for me. It worries me to think of my house and garden, lying idle there and going to ruin. I wonder if you would go there to live. The garden has raspberries and currants and strawberry plants too, and there are provisions in the house for a year. If you go there, I want you to take Cleo too and give her a home. She is a wonderful dog. I cannot tell you what she has been to me, and my horse Sailor that I left with the Ransoms would be handy for you to drive to town. I would feel better if I knew you were there, dear Helmi, and I hope you will go. It does not seem reasonable to believe that I shall ever come back, but if I do, the place will be in better shape for your having occupied it, so you will be doing me a good turn. Write soon and often, Helmi, please." At the bottom of the letter there was a postscript. "You will never need to be bothered with these meddlesome prospectors hunting for coal. For I bought all the mineral rights, so if the bank of the creek is solid coal, and I rather think it is, they can never come in without your consent. If you want to plant the garden this spring, you will find the seeds in the root house, all labeled. Maybe I had the wrong slant on life, Helmi, wanting to build a wall around myself. I have had time here to think it over, and I can see it was a mistake. One cannot live that way. Now I want you to do what you like with everything that is there. I have made my will, and left all to you. My lawyer here will arrange matters fully if anything happens. I enclose his address. Now we are going. A.W." Helmi was in her own little house when she read the letter, Cleo whimpering at her feet as if she knew her master had written. "He is well, Cleo, and he wants you and me to live together, and so we will. We had decided that already, and now I see God has sent me a home as well as a dog to keep me company. I do not know how we will make a living there, 8 miles from any settlement, but we should worry over a little thing like that. God will provide for us some way, Cleo." When Helmi returned to the city, she went to the hospital for news of Lily, and she went without fear. She had the assurance of Lily's safety, and as she sat in the small dark waiting room, it did not occur to her that she was a lonely girl in a big city, with a sick baby and no money. Helmi was already planning her summer and counting the days until little Lily could go with her. The nurse who had so kindly received the baby came to speak to her. "Oh, I remember you," she said, smiling. "You are looking much happier. I told you she would do well, and she has. She was very ill the second night, But a change came about daybreak. The fever left her then, and she went to sleep and has been doing well ever since. If you will go out and stand on the north side of the hospital, I will show her to you through the window." Helmi's face beamed with the prospect. "What will I have to pay?" she asked the nurse. "Nothing, dear, not a cent. The city provides this hospital. I will show her to you through the window." "It is like a dream," said Helmi. "Everyone is so good." When the nurse came with little Lily in her arms, and Helmi saw the beloved little head of brown hair and the little face like an exquisite flower, her heart was full of love and gratitude, and when the nurse lifted the tiny hand and waved it toward her, Helmi could not see any more for the rush of happy tears. She came back into the office again to ask for Roland. "I almost forgot the other baby," she said. "Is he doing well?" "You are more concerned than his mother," said the nurse, "though his grandmother has been here several times. He will get better, we think. He is a strong baby, but a baby needs to be loved. Care is not enough. There is something more." "I know," said Helmi. To the North Star rooming house, Helmi went to explain her absence to her good friends, the Corbetts. Mrs. Corbett was alone, and over a cup of tea, Helmi told her story. It was easy to tell Mrs. Corbett. She knew about God and how good he can be. "Thank God you're alive, Helmi. You gave me an awful scare, clearing out that way with the wild foreign look in your eyes. I did not know what you were up to, but I could only pray God to take care of you. For vain was the help of man, and me not knowing where to look for you. My gosh, child, what have you done to your boots?" Helmi told her about her flight through the woods, the coming of the dog, and everything. "Look at that now. Ain't God wonderful? That's what Christ said over and over again, only the people couldn't sense it. Well, I'm glad you found peace, Helmi. It's the greatest gift God has sent to us. And you got the money, too. We'll get a new pair of boots, child, good strong ones. If a person has good boots and a good bed, they're all right, for you are in one or the other of them all the time. And will you go to the Englishman's house, Helmi? But how can you live there alone, 8 miles from the mines? If you were near enough, you could run a boarding house." "I am going," said Helmi, "as soon as Lily is well enough. I am not a bit afraid now. And Mrs. Corbett, in the holidays, won't you let Rosie and Danny come? We'll get a cow somewhere, and there will be wild berries. And I know there will be lots of flour and oatmeal in the house, and it will be just like a picnic all summer. You will let them come, won't you, Mrs. Corbett? It will be a lot easier to let them go than to try to stop them when they hear of it. They're fair witched over you and the baby. Well, 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 Helmi dear. Ain't it wonderful how things come out?" When John Corbett was told the whole story that night, he sat for a long time, smoking a meditative pipe, its gentle put-put making the only sound in the room. Helmi was going to stay with them until Lily could be taken from the hospital. Number 18 being occupied, Helmi was to share Rosie's narrow bed, the lack of space of which would be amply overcome by the warmth of Rosie's affection. Helmi sat on a couch which later would be turned into a bed for Danny, and enjoyed the luxury of having such a welcome as the Corbetts gave her. "I am thinking," said John Corbett after a long pause, "that maybe the Englishman is the best man of the two." "Oh, no, no, Mr. Corbett," Helmi cried, distressed. "Mr. English is my good friend. I like him. He is so good. But I love my Jack. He is my man. There's a big kiista, what you call difference, isn't there, Mrs. Corbett? You tell him." "Tell him," said Maggie Corbett scornfully. "He knows, the sly old dog. He knows. I have often told him I'd rather be fighting with him than agreeing with any other man. That's love, and he knows it." End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Painted Fires by Nellie McClung. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Atul Sharma, Winnipeg, Canada. Chapter 30. Weymouth German prison camp, also known as Cella Lager 6, was built on a peat bog, from which the peat had been removed, leaving a sour, raw mud, on which not even a plank or log was laid. When the prisoners stepped out of the door, they went to their knees in the indescribable muck. The condition of the camp inside may be imagined. A crowded room of miserable men, 2 smoking stoves burning the smoldering peat, double rows of berths where greasy blankets on planks furnished the bed, despair written on young faces, despair and bitter hatred. Here sat Jack Doran on this wet night in January 1917, listening to the sleet slithering down the small windows. He had been in 3 prison camps before this, having attempted to escape from Gisan and from Cellelager I, been caught and strafed, the last time in the dark cells at Oldenburg. He was dressed in the garments supplied by the Red Cross for prisoners, and carried himself with something of his former erectness. A white V was showing in his brown hair, and there were hard lines around his mouth. 2 years of war had told on him. Still, there was something about him that suggested hope. Many of the prisoners had the beaten look of men whose spirits are broken, the condition of soul desired by the German guards for the men under their care. Jack Doran, thin, pale, determined, sat planning another escape. He had often wondered at himself for his tenacity. Life had not been so sweet that he should so earnestly desire it. In the days of his freedom, he had not found happiness, but the fires of youth still burning in his heart urged him on. He had been captured in the night attack on Gavrail, May 3rd, 1916, when part of his platoon lost their way in the darkness, and found that they had the enemy behind them as well as ahead of them, and suffered under heavy artillery fire. Jack ran back to try to save his captain, who had fallen wounded, and they were both captured and separated, his captain going to another camp. Jack had made his 2 other attempts in company with a Canadian, who was captured the same day, but when punished the last time in Oldenburg, his friend was sent to some other camp, for the German OC believed that separation would make it easier to hold these 2 adventurous ones. Soon after coming to Veamore, Jack had been fortunate in finding a compass under a pile of peat in the bog, where the prisoners were sent to work, probably left there by a prisoner who was fearful of having it found on him, and had abandoned it, along with his hope of escape. The possession of a compass, being proof of the desire to escape, was in German prison camps an indictable offense, but Jack had found a loose board in the wall beside his bunk, and there he now kept it. There were 2 other men in the camp who had attempted escapes, and between them and Jack a certain Freemasonry existed. They met as often as they could to discuss their plans, and on the coldest days volunteered for work on the bog in order that they might have a few hurried words together. They knew that if they showed any unusual friendship, they would be suspected of laying plans. Only desperate men would ever have dreamed of such a plan as theirs. The camp was fenced with 8 strands of barbed wire, and every 6th fence post carried an arc light. But with the aid of a file which one of the men possessed, they would cut the 2 lower strands at dusk, just before the lamps were lighted, and crawl through. At the last moment, the other 2 men grew panicky. "It is sure death," said one. "They'll catch us. I can see how they are watching us. I'd go and take a chance, only I have a wife and kid. I've got to think of them." The other man declared the plan a foolish one, on account of the weather. "January in Germany is too much like the corner of Portage in Maine," he said. A new batch of prisoners had come in that day, and one of them, who was standing near enough to hear, came to Jack and asked if he might go. He was a grizzled man of about 35. "I have no one depending on me," he said, "and I have already tried twice." "Come along, sure," said Jack. 3 times and out." "Thank you so much," said the man heartily. Jack was startled by his politeness. A prison camp does not always foster the social amenities. "Your name is Doran, is it not?" asked his new friend. "Mine is English. At least that is my nickname. We are both from Canada. We might as well try it as die here. There's always a chance." While the prisoners were taking their exercise just at nightfall, walking up and down the enclosure listlessly, aimlessly, Jack lay beside the fence, filing away the 2 lower strands of wire. This done, he crawled through, English following. The prisoners, who were all in the secret, kept a sufficient number directly in front of them to hide them from the camp. Out into the bog went the two desperate men, fighting for what we hold so lightly, because we have never lost it. Their enemies were cold and hunger, and the pitiless rains which seemed to fall every day. They journeyed only by night. Jack found his new friend's knowledge of the country to be remarkable. He seemed to know every village, and he spoke German as well as a native. In this way they were able to travel after dark on the roads, and once they got a lift from a kind-hearted wagoner, with whom English carried on a long conversation, eliciting the information that everyone was tired of the war, but it was considered the wisest course to give the English a proper beating and teach them not to start another. He asked them to come into his house for supper, but they were afraid to do so. Their Red Cross clothes would betray them. The kind-hearted man gave them some sticks of licorice from a bag he was taking home to his children. "This man is the true German," said English that night as they continued their journey. "Genial, simple, hard-working. The Germany that I knew when I lived here was a land of music, fairy tales, and a certain childlike simplicity. There was an inherent desire to make things beautiful, to turn desert places into gardens. But I was always afraid of the Prussians and their cast-iron methods. That, combined with the simplicity of the Germans, has made the war possible." The fugitives had need of all the advantages English's knowledge of the country and language gave them, for the season of the year was unfavorable. The leaves were gone from the trees, making shelter difficult. There were no vegetables in the gardens, no cows in the field to furnish hungry travelers with a handy meal, and they could not be sure of finding a spruce thicket or a wood of Scotch fir just when daylight was coming. But there was one advantage in winter travel: the nights were longer. 100 times Jack blessed the happy chance which brought English to camp that day. His knowledge of wood lore was wonderful. He seemed to carry everything that was needed, a sort of Robinson Sr. from Swiss Family Robinson. He made a fire each morning in the grey dawn to dry their clothes, explaining to Jack that a fire was almost invisible then. In daylight, the smoke shows; at night, the flame. But in the steely blue dawn, a fire can be enjoyed in comparative safety. In 2 weeks they reached the river, which would determine their fate. Beyond it lay Holland and safety. The first night they stayed in the woods on the bank, trying to think out a plan. The river was in flood, so swimming was out of the question. Uprooted trees floated in its current. Vainly, they hoped for a boat or a raft. The magical happenings which come to travelers in books did not come to them. Not a boat, not a raft, not even a rope. From their cover in the trees, Jack and his companion could hear the sounds from the other side of the river, the ringing of bells, the shunting of cars. There seemed to be only one way, and that was to attempt the bridge. It probably would be guarded heavily, but English's knowledge of German might help. It looked to be the only chance. All day they waited for the night to come. They had 2 good German smocks, stolen from a clothesline, and Jack had a warm pair of stockings. To get these, English had gone boldly into a garden as they came through a village. He had a way of quieting the dogs by a peculiar whistle, and this gave him a distinct advantage. The dogs, who came out barking fiercely, changed their attitude when he spoke to them, and even showed a disposition to follow him. "If the dogs could bring us food, we would have plenty," he said that day as they sat in the spruce thicket. "The chances are against us, Jack, but one of us may get over." "One of us!" exclaimed Jack. "It must be both or none." "No," said the other. "It does not matter much about me. No one cares so very much, and it happens that the one person who cares a little bit about me cares very much about you." Jack looked at his companion, dishevelled, dirty, long-haired and long-whiskered, his eyes bloodshot, and wondered if his mind were going. "And who is that?" he asked gently, as if he would humor his poor friend's mood. "Your wife, Helmi." "Helmi," Jack repeated. "My Helmi?" "Yes, yours. She is the only woman except my mother who ever cared whether I lived or died." Then he told Jack of his quarrel with Larsen in Eagle Mines, and of Helmi's kindness, and of the week he had stayed in her house. "She asked me to pray for you, Jack," he concluded, "and I kissed her golden hair. She told me she was sure you would go to the war, and asked me if I met you, Would I be your friend? That is why I came. It seemed as if I must come when I found you at Villamore." Jack's voice trembled as he spoke. "Then you are Arthur Warner, and I have been doing you wrong in my thoughts. No one told me you were hurt. They only gave me half the story. When I got back, I found Helmi gone without a word. She had been gone a week. I was a month late, but she might have waited." The trees were throwing long, cold shadows over the sweeping current of the river. "Did you not know there was a good reason for her going?" Arthur asked after a pause. "I knew nothing," said Jack. "What reason could there be?" "She went to the city to a hospital to give birth to your child." Jack's face grew white with pain. "How do you know?" he whispered. "She told me. I wanted her to come to England and train as a nurse, and when I urged her, she showed me a little dress she had been making, and she told me she was glad. Her only sorrow was that you were away, and the adventure you were on was dangerous." "I did not know," Jack groaned. There was a silence then, when neither man could speak. "Here are Helmi's letters," at length said Warner. "They belong to you now. They will tell you everything. If we both get over, I will take them back, after you have read them. I think if I had a wife like Helmi, I would not have doubted her. I don't think I would. However, I'm not saying that to hurt you. No one knows what he would do. Anyway, I am glad I met you, Jack, and your wife is well, and so is little Lily. And so, you see, you must get through. I may, but you must. And if you do, you will tell Helmi. Come on, our chance is just as good now as it ever will be." Jack took his hand and pressed it. "Arthur, I can't tell you what I want to say. You have been a better friend to Helmi than I have." The bridge was a fine iron one, with heavy studded pillars. Every second light was burning. The road leading to it was not much traveled, and as they walked up the long approach, their feet made a strange, echoing sound. They had left their blue overcoats open, showing the grey German smocks. Jack knew what he was to say in German if accosted, but their hope was that no one was on the bridge. Every step brought them nearer, and the lights ahead of them on the Holland side twinkled like the lights of home. Jack's heart was in a strange turmoil over what he had heard. On. They were halfway over now, steps echoing. No sound but the gentle murmurings from the other side, gentle sounds, dogs barking, cowbells. They must not hurry. On. 10 feet from the end now. Suddenly, from behind the last pillar stepped out a German guard, who thrust a flashlight in their faces, blinding them with its sudden gleam. At the end of his musket, a bayonet gleamed in the light. "Halt!" he cried. "Why do you halt us? We are honest men," said Arthur quietly. "Give me your passports, then," said the guard, putting away his flashlight but not lowering his rifle. Pretending to search his pockets, Arthur moved a little. Then, like a tiger, he sprang on the guard, grasping him around the neck. "I'll hold him, Jack," he shouted. "Beat it! You're safe! Beat it!" Jack found refuge in the trees on the other bank. There was a queer singing in his head, something droning like a swarm of bees. Then came a sudden pain in his shoulder like a knife thrust, and looking down, he saw the blood running off his fingers. But he must see what happened. He crawled to the edge of the trees and looked back. 3 guards were standing together, talking excitedly. He could see nothing of Arthur, but the smoke of rifles still hung around the pillars of the bridge. He crawled back into the trees and lay on the damp leaves, sobbing like a child. He was free. He was safe. But the loss of his friend was heavy on his heart. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Painted Fires by Nellie McClung. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Atul Sharma, Winnipeg, Canada. Chapter 31. It was a hot night in London in the early spring. The lights shone ghostly blue through their painted globes, and across the starless night searchlights stretched their spectral fingers, crossing, passing, converging, crossing again. Through the streets, in spite of the somber gloom and the dangers of the night, an endless stream of people drifted, making a brave show of unconcern. The theaters were crowded. The dance halls echoed with rhythmic feet and tinkled with laughter. And although grief, fear, and a sense of loss walked with every soul in London, the sound of their ominous footfalls were drowned by laughter and singing, true to the brave old British tradition. At Victoria Station, the VADs were assembled with their waiting stretchers, for a hospital train was coming in. There were the usual noises of a great station, hooting of sirens, blowing of horns, calling of railway officials, all the sounds multiplied by the vaulted station roof. There was the usual variegated and cosmopolitan crowd, though the dominant note was the khaki of the thick-set, calm-faced Englishman. Here the slim Canadian, independent and alert, actually looking for someone, and not ashamed of appearing anxious. There, the blue-uniformed French officer, darting through the crowd like a gorgeous bluebird. They are removing men on stretchers now, and the VADs are busy. Very skillfully they manage to roll the bed cases to the stretchers and carry them to the waiting ambulances. Pallid faces, all of them, some bandaged, but most of them smiling bravely too, and glad to be home. There is one VAD looking very slim in her blue serge uniform, who works feverishly. She is returning with an empty when she meets the walking cases coming out of their coach, some on crutches, some being helped by companions, arms in slings, bandaged faces, but all on their feet. She stops with a cry of gladness. "Jack! Oh, Jack!" she cries, as a young man with his arm in a sling is passing. "Jack, it's Ava! Don't you know me?" She threw her arms around him. "It's my only brother, she says to her companions, who wait for her. "Jack, are you a hospital case, or can you come with me? I have a flat. I can put you up. All right, wait for me inside on the first bench. I'll be through in half an hour." Jack sat on the bench inside, watching the crowds endlessly milling around him. He was surprised to meet his sister here, when he believed her to be safe in Winnipeg. He wondered what had brought her to London. Ava, the luxury-loving, indolent Ava. It was strange to see her in plain uniform, carrying stretchers, but there was a high look on her face that transformed her. She looked more like the Ava he had known long ago. Ava came for him at last, and led him to the rear of the great station, where endless cars were parked, and put him into one which seemed very small and low. "We pay a license according to wheelbase, you know," she laughed. "And anyway, a car is a car, no matter how small it is. Oh, Jack, it's good to see you. And I have a bed ready for you. I've kept lots of the boys. I've been here 6 months. Ava brought him to her flat and made a veil, and, switching on a light, revealed the luxurious living room, all in black and silver. "Do you like it, Jack?" she asked with evident pride. "I work all day in misery and horrors, so I have to have beauty at night." A large black velvet divan with round black cushions occupied one side of the room. The rug was black with a faint silver border, the fireplace black and white tiles, and on the mantel were silver candlesticks and a silver-wrought image of the Madonna. On the black lacquered table stood a silver basket of American beauty roses. A slim maid appeared with coffee and sandwiches. "We'll have a real meal later, Jack," said his sister. "And now tell me where you have been." "First," said Jack, "tell me how you happened to come over." Ava laughed. "You will wonder, I know, but I couldn't stand it after the old crowd broke up. And I guess I missed Humphrey too, though I won't admit it, because we had a row before he left and he said things to me I shall never forget. But anyway, everyone was knitting and making bandages and I couldn't get into it. So I rented the house and I can live easily here on the money. I really like the work I am doing, and I love the boys. They are so brave. I bring them home with me sometimes and write their letters and listen to their stories. I have one little extra room, and really, Jack, I never was so happy in my life. Now tell me your story." Jack told of his capture, imprisonment, escape, his friend Arthur Warner and his sacrifice. Ava's eyes were filled with tears as she listened. "Oh, Jack, wasn't he brave? But why did he do it? Why did he love you so?" "It was not for me. It was for his love for my wife." "Why, Jack, I didn't know you were married. Now begin at the beginning. Wait, Do you want to go to bed first? You look pretty white. I mustn't let you tire yourself. You see, I am a pretty good nurse now, and I know how to take care of people." "No, I am fine," said Jack. "My shoulder is nearly well again. I have had 2 months in the hospital with it, and I want to tell you all about it." Jack began with his meeting with Helmi at Eagle Mines, their marriage by the magistrate's objections, and his showing of the newspaper report. Jack was lying on the couch while Ava sat beside him, the light so shaded that he could not see her face. She sat motionless through it all. He told of his return from the north, and finding her gone, of his suspicions, confirmed as he thought by seeing her in Edmonton, of his sudden resolve to enlist, and lastly of his meeting with Arthur Warner. "I don't know," he concluded, "what is the explanation of the Winnipeg affair, but I know Helmi is innocent. She was sent to that place by someone and is shielding that person. Look at her letters, Ava. Read them. And to think I doubted her and left her alone when she needed me." Ava took the letters in her cold hands, but she could not read a word. "I got the news of my baby from another man," said Jack brokenly. "And it was his money Helmi got instead of mine to help her. Helmi had to beg for work and suffer insult. See what she says there? No one wanted a girl with a baby. Wasn't it damnable, Ava? I rage when I think of it. I blame myself. I shouldn't have believed anything. I knew how sweet and good and true she was. I knew. But the person that sent her for the dope and then slid out is the person who should be shot. And I'll sift it to the bottom when I go back. Poor Helmi, bearing it all because she was too honorable to tell." In his excitement and deep emotion, Jack did not notice that his sister had not spoken, but sat with bowed head like a broken lily. It was one of the soft nights when the blossoms are just beginning to scent the breeze, when there are those indescribable stirrings and whisperings of spring. Even if nations are at war and planning the destruction of each other, trees leaf and blossoms open. The streets seem quiet to Jack, but for the heavy rumbling of the buses, no one appeared to be abroad. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a weird, spitting noise as of giant firecrackers, a sound of deadly import to the people of England, for it gave warning of the approach of enemy aircraft. "What is it?" Jack asked, starting up. The street resounded now with the racing feet of people hurrying to shelter. "It's an air raid," Ava answered without stirring. "They run to the tube stations, but I never go. I feel safer here. I have a dread of being smothered in those terrible places. I've been through 3 air raids already, so I'm not afraid." Ava spoke with a composure which was not assumed. Anything was better than the maddening remorse that had swept over her as Jack told his story. Jack went to the window and looked down into the street. Through the open window came the drone of the enemy Zeppelins, malevolent, horrible, like the buzzing of some poisonous fly. Then came the continuous cannonading of the anti-aircraft guns, like the wildest days of battle. The searchlights combed the sky with their ghostly fingers, and people came tearing out of their houses and raced through the dark streets. Jack had often wondered how people would act during an air raid. He felt no fear for himself. It didn't occur to him that he could be in danger here in London. His fear was for Ava. "Hadn't we better go, Ava?" he asked anxiously. "It seems to be almost above us. Is the tube far away?" "Not far, but I never go. Come away from the window. There, that's a bomb, not far away. We're in for it, Jack. They're coming nearer. Come here, Jack. I feel dizzy. Come to me. I want to tell you something. I knew your Helmi in Winnipeg. She is not to blame. I sent her, Jack. Forgive me. I sent her to the Chinamans. Ask her to forgive me too. I have been sorry ever since." A bomb burst in the square. There was a shattering of glass and a crashing of masonry, a horrible confusion of noises, tearings, screamings, concussions, clanging fire engines. By a strange chance, the house in which Ava had her suite stood, though many houses in that vicinity fell. All the windows were shattered, and on the windowsill of the room in which they stood was thrown the body of a little dead dog. On the floor where she had fallen, Ava lay, a piece of shrapnel buried in her cheek. Jack stayed in London until Ava was out of danger. She would recover, the white uniformed doctor at Guy's told him, but of course she would be badly scarred. Behind her bandages, Ava smiled feebly. "It's all right, Jack," she said wanly, holding his hand. "Better women than I have been blown to pieces. Maybe God is giving me a few more years to atone for what I have done. I have been a poor sport, Jack. I needed a smash of some kind. I am not complaining. Life is queer, Jack, isn't it? I wanted to show Humphrey I wasn't as selfish and shallow as he thought. He told me in the last quarrel we had, and the only one, that I would never be an old woman. I would only be a stale novelty. I was determined to show him I had some thought of doing things for other people, so I came here and got into the VAD work. What I really wanted to do was to drive an ambulance in France, but I was afraid, not of death, but of disfigurement. I hate ugliness so, far more than sin. It was my hatred of ugliness, not of sin," Ava continued, "which cured me of the drug habit. I had learned to take dope just because it gave me a thrill. It saved me from dullness, but I saw an addict, one of the doctor's patients, a woman something like me, but horrible to look at, pasty-faced, dead-eyed, mouth agape, and I could see I might someday be like that. So, Jack, I never touched it again." Ava paused for a long time. "But now, with a blue scar on my cheek and my nose broken, I will not be afraid. I will go to France. Maybe I can take the place of some better and happier woman. And when the shell comes marked for her, it will take me instead. And Jack," she continued, "you will tell Helmi all of this and ask her to think as kindly of me as she can. She loved me once, with all a young girl's adoration." Jack kissed his sister tenderly with a deep sorrow in his heart. He could not reproach her. There was no need. But his own heart was aching with the sorrow of it all. Sin and sorrow. The age-old partnership. Sin and sorrow. By one man sin came into the world, and death by sin. But the one who sins is not always the one who suffers. Jack had cabled Keith, his former partner, from Paris to send to London $1,000. But when he reached London, he found that no reply had come. The information received there was alarming. Thomas Keith of Winnipeg could not be found. He had left the city over a year ago, and his creditors had not been able to trace him. Jack sat on one of the wooden benches in the cable office in London and thought, in a queerly detached way, of what this meant to him. He wondered at his own calmness in the face of such a smashing blow. For the gold mine on the Nahanni, with all the comfort and luxury it would bring him, had been much in his thoughts during the cheerless months of imprisonment. He had planned many generous surprises for his companions, too. And now it was all over. He had been following a false light. He had been warming his hands at a painted fire. Well, there was about $200 coming to him from the War Office, and he would be given transportation home. Prisoners who had escaped through a neutral country were not allowed to go back into the army. When the Olympic sailed out of the harbour at Liverpool into the muddy waters of the Mersey, Jack stood on the deck looking back at the receding shores of England. Behind him lay many bitter thoughts and much disillusionment. The futility of war, the hideous wastage of young life, the horrible suffering and slaughter, and Ava, his only relative. He choked with bitter memories as he thought of it all. Then there came to him, beating up through all this, like a fountain of sweet water in the sea, the memory of Arthur Warner and his unselfish love, and of Helmi with her clear, sweet soul and her honorable silence. Jack walked away to the prow of the vessel and looked away into the grey distance. Behind him lay the sorrow for the past, with its mistakes and regrets. Before him lay Canada, his own country, Helmi and the little Lily. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Painted Fires by Nellie McClung. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Atul Sharma, Winnipeg, Canada. Conclusion. At Arthur Warner's bungalow, the flowers were blooming. Hollyhocks stood straight and tall against the house, with their quaint old-fashioned rosettes in prim rows on their stalks, crimson and cream and white. Arthur had planted them, but had not seen them bloom. The walk from the house was bordered with round clumps of dwarfed nasturtiums, orange and red, alternating with mounds of sweet alyssum and candy tuft, white as snow, and at their feet in a straight line, marking the edge of the gravel path, ran a line of ground lobelia, as blue as the skies above. On one side of the walk stood a rockery of stones from the river, which Helmi had whitewashed, and from which now grew trailing nasturtiums in all the shades from creamy pink to scarlet and crimson, peeping out from their glossy green leaves. On the other side was a rustic bench, made gay with cushions, where one could sit and think and dream, watching the changing lights upon the mountains. Here sat Helmi thinking and dreaming this Saturday afternoon in late August. Her family had all gone to Eagle Mines, Rosie and Danny Corbett, who were spending the holidays with her, old Sim and young Lily, the latter now an inquiring young lady of 2.5 years. The teacher, too, who boarded at the bungalow, had gone with them. Twice a week, Helmi sent to town a load of vegetables and fresh fish from the English River, and steadily her savings in the bank were increasing. It seemed a long time since she had climbed into the old buckboard, with Lily on her knee, Cleo close beside her, and the pups in a box behind, and canvassed the neighborhood to see where she could get a cow on terms to suit purchaser. She had been successful in her quest, and brought the cow home with her, the terms being that she do the weekly washing for the numerous and increasing Peterson family, 3 miles away. Helmi thought of her neighbors now with real affection. They had all befriended her, and she was glad that Arthur Warner had learned to know them better. Helmi had told them quite frankly all she knew of him, and when his letters came she made no secret of them. When she made the suggestion that weekly meetings should be held at his house, where knitting and sewing could be done for the soldiers, the women gladly came, and a new spirit of friendliness came to the settlement. Every week a letter was written to him and parcels sent, and so it came about that, though thousands of miles intervened, Arthur Warner had come to know his neighbors, and they him. No letters had come from Arthur now for several months, and Helmi feared that the shadow she had seen upon his face the day she said goodbye to him had fallen. In her dream she had seen a luminous figure, all in white, that had walked over to Arthur and tapped him on the shoulder, and he nodded his willingness and went away. And the same night Cleo had fretted and cried all night and would not be comforted. But the boxes went every week, for Helmi and the women knew that some poor soldier would be the happier for them. Of Jack she had not had a word, and in the midst of all her happiness and achievement, there was the one sore thought which sometimes required all Helmi's faith to drive away. Jack's face, so sad and drawn, drifting away from her on the slowly moving train, fell across her happiest hours. But Helmi had not forgotten the experience she had the night of the storm, when her soul was lifted high above the mists of the earth. The hearts of the women were knitted to Helmi's, because she had a way of comforting them in their troubles. There was strength in the touch of her hand, and healing in her presence. "Look what she's done for me," old Sim would often say, "when I got crippled for good, and couldn't do my work in the mine any more. Come to me, Sim," she said. "I am all alone except for little Lily and the dogs, and I need you, Sim," she says, "for company, making out I would be doing her a favor. Look what a home she has given me." It was Helmi, too, who discovered the seam of coal a little further up the river, shining and hard, that burned with a blue flame and gave off more heat and burned longer than any other coal she had ever seen. And it was like her to tell all the neighbors about it and urge them to come and get all they wanted for their winter fires. The peace which comes to those who work hard and have a clear conscience was Helmi's that afternoon as she listened to the waterfall behind the house. And through her dreaming came the happy consciousness that her family would soon be home, hungry from town, and she would need to go into the house and get supper ready. The valley before her was beginning to show the purpling tints of evening as the sun wheeled its way over the mountains. A car came quickly around the turn of the hill, its wheels making no sound in the dusty road. It was halfway to the house before Helmi saw who it contained. That night, after the others had gone to bed, Jack and Helmi sat long before the fire. Little Lily, in her pretty white nightdress, was fast asleep in her father's arms. "Let me lay her down, Jack," said Helmi, but Jack could not part with her. "Remember, I am 2 years and a half behind," he said. Helmi bent over him as she tucked the shawl around the little girl. "You won't leave us again, Jack, will you? Not even to go for gold to the Nahanni?" "Gold from Nahanni?" Jack repeated after her. "I should say not. What do I need of Nahanni gold?" Then, drawing Helmi's face to his, he said tenderly, "I got my gold from Finland." 8 years have gone by. The Warner mine is one of the best in the province, for the coal is a high-grade anthracite. Unlike most mine owners, the Dorans have not moved to the city, but have a large grey stucco house with a red roof and many windows on the bank of the English River. Behind the house is a large grassy playground, enclosed by a high board fence, where a happy group of children and collie dogs may be seen at play. There is one old dog that walks stiffly, but is plainly the best beloved of all. Below the falls stands a green and white bathhouse, into which the water is piped from the stream. It is called the Finnish bathhouse, because there is in it a room for steam baths, where the steam is formed by water falling on heated stones. There is a recreation ground across the road, and a white church on the hillside. In the basement of the church there is a well-appointed dining room, where the boys and girls clubs often meet for supper parties. The bungalow is a clubhouse for the miners and their wives, and on the lawn there is a simple white stone with an inscription which reads, "Sacred to the memory of Arthur Warner, who made the first settlement in this valley, and who loved its solitude and beauty. In 1914, he answered the call of his country. On January 25th, 1917, while escaping from a German prison camp, he deliberately gave his own life to purchase freedom for his companion, who now erects this stone in the hope that as long as grass grows in the valley and water runs in the English River, the memory of Arthur Warner may not fade." The end. End of chapter 32. Conclusion. End of Painted Fires by Nellie McClung.